They are on the webinar, yes. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. First, I want to emphasize that this is, at least obviously from a Canadian delegation standpoint, a dress down day. So I think others should take their cue as they wish. Thanks, Jim. There you go. We can wear it again on Friday. I think it's Ian looking so dressed up every day that's the most jarring for me. I mean, scientists aren't supposed to look that good. Dress that well, I should say. So before we get started with the agenda for this morning, I just wanted to confirm with you, Jim, and all our commissioner colleagues, further to the discussion we had at the end of the day yesterday, that the updated or expanded decision table that was discussed would be made available more broadly to folks. The only question I have, Bruce, is are we confident that people would understand what the additional information is or why it's there? How do we go about conveying that?
Ian and I talked this over a bit, and Ian can write a header for the table that explains the why-fors of the fact that the Commissioner asked for some additional rows and columns in that table to further flesh out your thoughts on how you might be making your decision.
Explanatory note of some kind?
Yeah.
Okay. So why don't we, what I would like to recommend is that Ian work on that, and then maybe at the break we could just take a quick look at it and agree on it, and then on that basis, Jim.
Bruce both mentioned yesterday, our harvest objective for the stock is tied closely to the harvest rate. I mean, that's the objective. And so nothing in this table shows you what the harvest rate is for each of these rows. And so we even had trouble with that last night as we were asking, well, what's the harvest rate associated with these lines? And so I scratched them down on some paper. So if you, I don't want to make it more bulky and burdensome, but if you could show at each rate what the harvest rate is, particularly since that's the best way to describe the difference between these rows, since the percentages all stay the same, the 3% all the way down, or 98%. But if you show the harvest rate that's effective on the stock, there is some variation there, and I think that would make this much more useful.
I agree with that. The question would be, what, the target harvest rate or the realized harvest rate?
I think it would be the effective coast-wide harvest rate for each one of those rows. In the same way that we had it for your original decision table, there was an effective coast-wide harvest rate for each row. So, for example, if we look at in your blue book, table 4 on page 120, you'll see on the far right column is the harvest rate that were associated with those rows. So I think what Ian would be able to do here is simply duplicate that column for the expanded table.
So the far right coast-wide harvest rate?
Yes.
That's what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Right. Knowing that, in fact, by regulatory area, it is not always the same number right across, right?
Correct.
What do you think? Oh. Okay. So let's do that, if that is relatively straightforward. It makes it a very wide piece of paper now, as well as lengthy downwards. So, but let's look at that and then maybe have a quick look at Ian's explanatory note, which as layman may need to edit to put in layman's terms, and then we can distribute the document. Thanks for that. So this morning we have, just want to make sure we're in we had a few things on the Alaska, dealing with Alaska late yesterday. So now I think we'll revert back to what would have been the first discussion of 2C. Would it be 2C first, Bruce, that we're going to go by sort of geographically upwards, shall we say? So are we doing the reports for 2C now? Is that?
Sorry. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. We're looking at all of Alaska at once, and so each one of the reports have some component for each one. So.
Right, okay. So who's up first?
We went through, my notes indicate we went through 6.1 and 6.2 yesterday, but I think Glenn was here to perhaps address some outstanding questions from from the NIMS report that you had.
That's right, that was his report. Do we want to revert back to that? First of all, can you confirm, is Philip and Ralph
they are on
hooked in? You still haven't fixed the phone problem. Right?
We're just conferencing in on the regular phone.
Yeah.
When? Like now or later?
Are they?
We don't have any way that's going to be satisfactory.
We can't do what we did in our closed session yesterday?
Without creating a lot of feedback issues.
But did we have those during the closed session? Because they were on the webinar during the closed session.
We can do it during the closed session.
But we weren't using
webinar creates feedback.
Oh,
We
I
weren't
see.
using the microphones during the
Oh, I see. Okay.
But they were able to chat with.
No, I appreciate that. Okay. As long as then maybe, but for this afternoon, they'll be able to be,
Right.
we'll be able to hear their voices. Okay, that's good. Okay, so Glenn, do you want to come to the table? Thanks. It was really in relation, Jane was delivering some comments on the council's letter of December 14th, and you had there was a paper that was ascribed to you that was with that as well, and there were some questions. I think, Paul, you had a couple of questions on it that maybe we could just have with you present to be able to answer. Is that okay? Go ahead, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. It was a question on, it's in 6.1, and it's on page 3, and the top table has the halibut PSC limit for the trawl at 3,200, and then I flipped to page 4, and the bottom table there has a range across years 2008 through 2012, and it had a decreasing amount of the PSC limit at 2325, and I'm sure there's a simple explanation, but what the difference was for the two numbers.
Thank you, Commissioners. The table that you have on page 3 is the total halibut PSC or bycatch limit for all trawl fisheries. And the table that you have on page 4 is just for one component of those trawl fisheries, what we call the Amendment 80 fisheries. They are managed under a catch share or a quota program. So if you added up the 2,325 with the other limit that is assigned to non-catch share fisheries in the Bering Sea, that limit is 875, you come up with the 3,200 metric tons.
Can I, the other question I had about it, thanks for that, I thought it might be something like that. How were the PSC limits defined?
Do you mean originally?
Yeah, originally, and so then you have the Section 80, and I guess I kind of wonder as well about what Section 80 means more broadly. So some seem to have a decreasing limit, and so what I guess the two questions is, how were they originally designed, the PSC limits, and what's Section 80 mean, and it has a decreasing amount, and so some are in a decreasing regime and others are fixed?
To be honest, in terms of the specific number, the 30, originally this was I believe, a 3,600 metric ton limit that was established in the Bering Sea, and then there have been subsequent revisions to programs since that time. To be perfectly honest, I'm not exactly sure where that number originally came from, but I think that original 3,600 limit was established back in the mid-'80s, if I'm not mistaken. Since that time, however, we've looked at that limit, and the reason that the Amendment 80 program had a decreasing limit is as we established the catch share program, one of the components that the council wanted to recognize is as you move to those catch share programs, you're better able to control your halibut bycatch, and wanted to ratchet down the overall allocations to that number in order to accommodate some of the improvements that could occur.
So why are some in and some not?
So now you get to the complicated aspect of U.S. management, right? So in terms of the fisheries themselves, the reason that the Amendment 80 program had a reducing bycatch limit and was established as a catch share program was really more of a driver through the council process. There had been concerns by participants in these fisheries, and the Amendment 80 fisheries are basically flatfish fisheries in Bering Sea, Pacific cod trawl fisheries as well. There's Anaca mackerel, and there's also a rockfish fishery as well. So it was a component of about 6 species that are comprised of the Amendment 80 program. And through the council process, the industry had come up with suggested ways to address some of the bycatch goals that the council had by also adopting a catch share program. So the reason that that program is in with a reduction in the PSC limits was really a driver through the industry process and through the council process. The other participants in the trawl fishery, some of them, the largest component of which are in the pollock fishery, haven't necessarily been in a position where they have been able to coordinate internally enough to come up to the council with some cohesive plan as to how they intended to improve fishing within their specific fisheries and further reduce their bycatch in those fisheries. And the 875 metric tons that's allocated to those other fisheries primarily go to support the pollock fishery, which has a relatively limited halibut bycatch, and then the Pacific cod trawl fishery. So that Pacific cod trawl fishery, there are roughly 100 participants in that fishery. I think there just hasn't been the kind of cohesiveness that there was with participants in the Amendment 80 sector to sort of address some of these issues.
Yes, thank you very much.
Just before Bruce, just want to make sure, are there other commissioner comments or questions? Or, sorry, does Ralph have or Phil?
A question from Philip asking from yesterday and today on the bottom of page 3, the bottom graph, both the trawl and non-trawl halibut PSC increased in 2012. Do you know what fisheries specifically contributed to the increase? And then he asks also at the graph above on page 4, similar question, which fisheries are responsible specifically, if any, for the increased bycatch rates in 2012?
So as I'm reading the graph on page 3, I do see that uptick that occurred in 2012. When I look at the Gulf of Alaska, the graphic that you see on page 4, I actually see a slight decrease relative to 2011. That's the red line that I'm looking at. In terms of the Bering Sea, that uptick that you're seeing relative to last year, I think is probably due to a couple of fisheries. One, there was slightly more halibut PSC that was taken this year in the pollock fishery. Typically, it's a relatively low bycatch amount, but this year amounts increased somewhat in that fishery. And then one thing I should note overall is that the limit, the total bycatch is below the halibut PSC limit, but there was, I believe, also a slight uptick in the Pacific cod fishery by some participants in the Amendment 80 sector, still below their allocation, but more than it had been in previous years. Those are the two fisheries primarily that would be responsible for the uptick that you're seeing in, on the graphic on page 3. For page 4, I guess I'm reading that as a decrease relative to 2011.
Both the cod and the pollock tax increased
Right. Right. And as Jim just noted, there was an increase both slightly in the overall available catch for the pollock fishery and also the Pacific cod fishery. It's about 1.2 million metric tons slight increase this year, and then I believe it was about 300,000 overall for the Pacific cod fishery this year.
Another question, Paul?
On page 5, it talks about the observer program restructuring. Is there any further update around how that is progressing?
Sure. So at the beginning of this year, I think for purposes of our discussion here, a couple of things that be useful for the Commission to keep in mind. We've expanded the overall proportion of catch, number of trips, and vessels that are subject to what we call the full coverage category. And for the trawl fishery, for trawl catcher processors, those vessels are required to have 2 observers on board at all times. So they trade off in 12-hour shifts. For the hook and line catcher processors, they are required to have 1 observer on board at all times, in addition to having a video monitoring system that can be used for compliance monitoring on board the vessel, but is not used for catch estimation. And then we also have expanded observer coverage on our pot catcher processors, and there's a limited number of jig catcher processors actually operating in the Gulf of Alaska. They too have expanded observer coverage. In addition to that, we have modified the way that we conduct our partial coverage, and for the most part, almost all of the Bering Sea is under the full coverage category. There's a limited proportion of the catch that's under what we call partial coverage. Under the partial coverage category, we base that into 2 different groups. There's what we call a vessel selection pool and a trip selection pool. Vessel selection pool comprises most of the halibut and saberfish IFQ fisheries, and then for vessels that are over 57.5 feet, we have a trip selection pool. Vessels in the trip selection pool have approximately a 15% chance of each trip being randomly selected for observer coverage. And that's a pretty substantial change from the way that we have done business in the past, where the vessel operators would tell us when they would like observer coverage. The program was designed primarily to address some of those issues of deployment bias. And then within the vessel selection pool, that fleet had previously not been subject to observer coverage under our program, and they have roughly a 10% chance of having their trips during a 2-month period being subject to observer coverage. So as the program is rolled out, we have begun deployment. Right now we're deploying primarily on vessels in the vessel selection pool. We have just begun some of our trawl fisheries, so those that are subject to the partial coverage category now are having trips observed under that. And then, of course, we have the expanded coverage for the full coverage throughout both the Bering Sea as well as the Gulf of Alaska now. And we're planning on a series of reports to our North Pacific Fishery Management Council. The first of those, we'll have kind of an informal discussion with them in Friday in about a week, but the next formal report will be in April, and then we'll follow one up in June and then October. And based on the information that we get from this year, we'll be working with the council and the industry to modify our deployment plan for future years to accommodate needs in various fisheries as we see them.
On the partial coverage, what do you estimate will be the coverage?
In terms of total number of vessels?
Yeah.
So I think for the partial coverage category, any vessel has an opportunity of being selected. So it's really every trip can be randomly picked, and that will vary from vessel to vessel. Within the Gulf of Alaska, which is where most, over 150 vessels might be subject to that. Again, that will vary quite a bit depending upon whether or not vessels are participating from the Bering Sea. Vessel participation numbers can vary quite a bit from year to year. In terms of the partial coverage category for the vessel selection pool, the smaller boats, the halibut and sablefish vessels, rationale for that is that compared to the total component of groundfish taken by those vessels to other vessels that are larger than 40 feet, that was roughly about 1 or 2% of the total groundfish that we were observing. So the decision was made for this year not to include coverage on those smaller vessels, primarily because we didn't see a clear management need that would be met for that. So they're already kind of excluded from the program, if you will. Of the vessels that are in that partial coverage category that might be subject in the vessel selection pool, there's probably about 450 of those that we anticipate will be active in this year.
And those are vessels fishing for other species, not for halibut, right?
They are vessels that are fishing for halibut. There are also vessels that are fishing for Pacific cod, hook and line primarily.
Okay.
Some of them also have limited participation in Pacific cod fisheries.
Okay. Other commissioners have other questions? Another one, Steve, from?
Yes, a question from Ralph and a question from Philip. Ralph asks, and it may be more of what you were just talking about, what will the observer coverage be in 2013 in the Gulf of Alaska for the longline fleet and the under 60-foot trawl fleet?
So for the under 60-foot trawl fleet, they'd be subject to the trip selection pool, which is about a 15% probability of every trip being selected. And then for the hook and line fishery, it'd be roughly about a 10% chance of being selected for coverage.
All right, thank you. And then Philip asks, was the cod bycatch increase due to cod TACs being increased in 2012? And he's specifically talking about Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands.
Commissioners, I think I would need to go back and verify with the data. I don't recollect that the rates increased substantially, so I think the rates were roughly about the same, but there was an increase in the total TAC relative to previous years, and I think that likely accommodates much of it, but I can reconfirm with my staff.
Dave?
Can I ask you on monitoring of vessels in the under 57.5 feet? I know that Alaska has done some pilot studies on deployment of electronic monitoring, and I've heard from a few fishermen up in Alaska that they're interested in going down that route. Why have you chosen to go with the flesh and blood observers over EM?
So there's a couple of aspects of our program. When the observer program was originally envisioned, as it's been rolled out, it was intended to aid in the collection of biological data. And at the time that we were working with the council, one of the challenges we faced was how do we get that kind of biological information using the available camera technology that we have today. The industry, also by National Marine Fisheries Service, since that time to try and figure out what application cameras may have in terms of being able to collect some of those data without, I think there's kind of available technologies and challenges in terms of the enforcement of information that we may get from video monitoring that we're still trying this year. We're working with a number of the participants primarily focused on the hook and line fisheries as well, where I think there's been the greatest need and interest for exploring EM. We're back with an outline of a strategic plan for how to deploy electronic monitoring beginning in April, and then we'll follow that up formally with the council in June. And I've informally been meeting with folks here at this meeting as well to try and figure out ways we might better improve communication between us and the industry on how to expand that in the future.
Any other commissioner questions? I have one, but I'll wait for a second because Bruce, you wanted to raise something. You're okay? Okay, thanks, Glenn, for much of that. Just a couple of questions. One is with respect to the limits and the verification of those limits. So based on the existing observer program, I'm just trying to understand what we mean by full coverage. So that is 100% of the time for, let's say, the trawl fishery, the pollock trawl fishery, there is an observer on board. And so the catch limits, the metric ton catch limits here are based on observers indicating or having a conversation with the fish captain about the limitation. And it's done by it's a collective, right? So how is it managed in the fleet when you get to that limit? How is that communicated about the stop fishing requirements, et cetera?
Right. So we get direct feeds of data from the onboard observers themselves. So the way that it'll work is they'll be sampling on board the vessels. They'll report their halibut bycatch. We get that directly fed into us. Goes through our system from all of the different vessels. In terms of communication back to the fleet, for the Bering Sea, it's facilitated because those vessels are almost exclusively participating in some form of catch share program, a core management program. Industry participants who get also the same direct feed of observer information after we've looked at the data to verify its accuracy. That gets communicated directly from those industry participants to all of the vessel captains, in addition to us communicating that information to vessel captains, so they know to stop, to stay within their quotas as well. For many of those catch share programs, they also have fairly complicated and somewhat draconian private contractual arrangements that they establish between the various companies to keep them below the various limits as well. For those fisheries that aren't subject to some sort of catch share management or quota management, we do obviously maintain very close connection with closer to their limits. They too, even though a lot of those fleets don't have catch share programs, also work with us, and unions are looking at a closure based on rate expectations. And for the most part, we've been very good at staying below those limits. For the Gulf of Alaska, where there's less of those not reflected in this paper because it gets very complicated. We have seasonal closures and specific categories of fisheries that are subject to these halibut PSC limits in various areas. So we monitor each of those and close each of those in turn as we get it close to them.
So just I understand, that means that when you look at the chart or PSC limits, halibut PSC limits, that includes both those involved in the catch share program and those not involved. So it's like a global, but some is done through observer coverage and some is done through, what should we say, management.
Yeah, that catch is subject to, it's coming from vessels that have two observers on board. That's primarily the trawl catcher processor fleet. That other information for the small number of vessels in the Bering Sea that don't have full coverage, they still have some partial coverage as well. So what we'll do for the estimation is we can apply the rate from the fully observed vessels to those unobserved vessels to determine exactly, to provide an estimate. If they do have observer coverage, then we'll use that more appropriate and available information for that small proportion of the fleet that isn't observed.
It's all from observers. None of it's self-reported.
Right, right.
And do the observers report on, is it possible for them to report on the amount of the catch underneath the limit, which is U26, or, I mean, basically juvenile fish versus mature fish? Are they able to disaggregate that way?
They take length measurements and weight measurements as they do their sampling. So I believe that information goes directly to IPHC as well.
So we have, in fact, a breakdown. So if we looked at the table on page 3, the estimated catch of, let's say, from the trawl fleet of 2,900 metric tons, there'd be a breakdown of how much of that is juvenile fish and how much of it is. Okay. Is that, can we make that information, where is it available?
I believe that's in the raw. Let me just check it.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Sorry, go ahead, somebody, Ralph or Phil?
Yeah, I have a question each from Ralph and Philip. Ralph is about the observer coverage if there are suspect problems in a fishery. Could we get extra coverage on the fleets that have the highest level of halibut bycatch in 2013?
So our new observer program has a protocol where we go through an annual deployment process, and that's something that for this year's first year of the program, the goal was to try and get a better understanding on bycatch overall, including on a number of the vessels that are unobserved. We'll be reviewing that information starting in June, And I think there'll be some policy directive that can come through the council process about deployments and where they think that appropriate deployments may occur. The other thing that we're trying to do with the program is to better understand variance between various fisheries and to try and target observer coverage so that those fisheries with wider variance would have more coverage to reduce that variance so we improve the accuracy and precision of that estimate.
Mr. Chairman, if you look on page 330 of your RAW Table 8, it gives a breakdown of the percent less than 65 centimeters and the percent less than 82 centimeters for all fisheries that are covered by observers in Alaska. We don't actually present the size frequencies, but we can if those are desirable, but we do have it broken out by, so sub 82 is under 32 inches and sub 65 is under 26.
Okay, thank you. And Philip had a question, I think?
Yes, Philip asks, do you know if the BSAI cod longline bycatch rate increased in 2012? It seems that this rate could be compared to the commercial halibut WPUE rates.
Just looking at the graph that you have on Table 3, that rate has been fairly constant overall. There was a slight uptick, as I mentioned earlier, in the Pacific cod total available catch, but I believe that rate has been fairly stable for the last several years. And that's the blue line that you're seeing on page 3. Yeah. Oh, you don't have it on color, so it's the lowermost solid graph.
One last question for me, and it's picking up from Paul, and maybe you answered and I didn't quite hear it properly. You're looking at that lower graph on page 3, the upper line, the dotted line, which I guess that's for the trawl fishery. Just under 3,500 is the limit in 2003, 2002, I guess that would be. And in 2012, it's 3,200. How is the number established? What is the sort of thinking behind or the information behind the establishment of the limit?
Of this specific number that you have there,
yeah,
that 3,200. And again, I think this is going back to the early 80s when that original limit was established. I believe at the time it was meant to accommodate the anticipated bycatch in the fisheries, as well as trying to minimize the overall catch relative to the halibut stock. But I don't have specific information in front of me as to where that number originally developed. I don't know if Greg is available or somebody who remembers who was here then.
Mr. Chairman, we might bring Greg in here because I think he has that knowledge in terms of how this.
I mean, just Jim, before you answer, just in terms of context of the question, I'm trying to figure out, particularly in thinking sort of over, but even over this time period, as we all know, there are a number of concerns expressed by various sources about the level of bycatch, and I'm trying to figure out, well, what is quite beyond the sort of, let's call it, allegation of impact. What information are we using to be able to make the best guess about what is a tolerable level of bycatch? Is really the question I'm trying to ask. What are the inputs that are on an annual basis determining how that number should be established? Is really the question.
I think Greg's just next door and he's coming in.
Okay. Okay. Well, we can come back to this.
To give you some background, Mr. Chairman, in the halibut bycatch work group tech report that was published this year, there is a background for the history of what some of these limits are, and I think Glenn has characterized that fairly correctly. I think in terms of how they were established, it was kind of an expectation of what do we need to sort of run these fisheries at that time. They were initially established as total catch limits, and then later transferred. In 1991, they were still total catch, and then in 1993, I think they were transferred over to mortality limits.
So, Mr. Chairman, we have some laws in the United States that require us to try to achieve optimum yield, and when that process works, which is by law in Alaska using the North Pacific Fishery Management Council, There's 11 people that sit there and try to decide what is the best way to use all of the resources to the best benefit of the nation. And I don't think any of those 11 people would think it would be right to have a halibut bycatch of 0, because that means you wouldn't catch 1 billion pounds of pollock that feeds the world. You wouldn't catch 1 billion pounds of other fish in Alaska that feeds the world. And so a halibut bycatch of 0 would be wrong. It would probably be illegal. We'd get sued and we'd lose. On the other hand, we don't want to have 10,000 tons of bycatch, because the other part of the law requires us to reduce the bycatch as we can. I forgot the phrase, the term of art, as much as practical. And so it's a semi-political group of people that are trying to discover, to the best that they can, the best way to select those catch limits on all of the target species, on all of the species that, for some reason or other, someone has decided these animals should not be caught with anything except a hook and line, because it would be illegal to catch a halibut with a trawl. They've tried to mix all that together. So the combination of things that started with that 3,200 tons came out of that collective body. That was their best guess for a way to prosecute that fishery for the purposes as laid out in our national laws. And since that time, we've worked. There may have been, so since '80, there's been probably 500 meetings of that council. I think that's an exaggeration. We could calculate it. I don't know if there's any of those meetings that have ever taken place when bycatch didn't come on the agenda at some level for some sector in some area. So this is an ongoing process. I understand for people that are solely looking at halibut, it hasn't gone fast enough. But that's where those numbers come from. It comes out of that process of those 11 individuals that change over time as their terms expire, to the best of their ability to select a mix of fishes that achieves the optimum yield as they see it. So I don't think you'll discover a document or an administrative record that says we took this fish and this fishery and it needed 1,000 tons and this one did 200. It was a collective decision that came out of that process. Our records are much better now. Back in 1980, I don't know that all those numbers would be written down, but it isn't an arbitrary number. It was something that was derived and determined with a lot of work from that group.
Thanks, Jim. I understand that. In fact, in Canadian domestic fisheries, we have a very similar rigor that we try to put into the management of bycatch. So I think we're not hardly the only two countries that are unique in recognizing the importance of that and trying to put some rigor into the process. The added wrinkle here is that this is an international fishery. This is a bilaterally managed fishery, where domestic and national law considerations are not the only considerations. It's also international law considerations, including the duty to cooperate in the management of shared stocks, straddling stocks. So that's when those 11 individuals get together, as you described them, to make those decisions, there is that extra wrinkle that we also need to figure out, not just in a conversation that the American domestic process has, but the Canadian one as well. That takes into account the fact that this is internationally or bilaterally managed fishery. As a consequence, we need to ensure that those additional considerations that come with the responsibility that we both have, both Canada and the United States, to manage that collectively in a way that's in support of the sustainability and conservation of the stock is done as effectively as possible. So there may be an element where we could consider, further consultations between experts on both sides that involve or inform our respective domestic processes in that regard that may be considered or should be considered or maybe they have already been considered. I don't know. Just based on my knowledge so far, which I appreciate is not full. It's not clear to me how, based on the fact that it's an international fishery or bilateral fishery, that kind of component of that dynamic, shall we say, or that the responsibilities that come with that are integrated into the decision-making process. I mean, that's what this commission is frankly all about, right, is to try to play partly that role, but it's partly that role in the context of understanding these are domestic decision-making processes primarily that are occurring. Anyway, obviously something we should discuss further, but I'm not asking or saying this in any way to question or suggest that somehow there isn't rigor or there isn't commitment in the process. It's just trying to make sure we have full understanding, given its international fishery, about how we work together in support of the common objective. Okay, any other, before I turn it to our other colleagues who may have questions in the public here, do we have any other commissioner questions, or Dave?
Just one comment, and perhaps I can turn it into a question. There's been quite a bit of work done in Area 2B and more recently in Area 2A to reduce halibut bycatch in the trawl fisheries by employment of individual bycatch caps. And I think we've seen most recently in 2A, if I'm not wrong, a 70% decrease in the halibut bycatch in those trawl fisheries. And there seems to be a body of evidence growing that this is an effective way to, at the same time, reduce the bycatch of incidental fish, and in this case halibut, and still get your target species out of the water. And it seems like you're inching towards that up in Alaska. We did hear yesterday from Jane de Cosmo and her colleague that there is some call from the trawl fleet to have bycatch IQs, and that's very encouraging. And certainly, from my perspective anyway, I hope that work can proceed as quickly as possible. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Can we provide an opportunity now for others who wish to come to the mic or on the webinar to ask any questions? And for those of you who weren't here yesterday, if you do have a question, the corner of the table here is the location to come to. Does anyone wish to address the Commission or ask a question? Okay, thank you. Thanks, Glenn. And maybe when Greg comes back, or if we have, we can always have a further conversation as appropriate if needed. Thanks very much, Glenn. Okay, who's up next?
Mr. Chairman, the enforcement folks asked if they could do their presentation now because of their own scheduling. So.
Sure, no problem. So if you could just introduce yourself when you come to the mic. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Burke Waldron. I'm the operations commander for the Alaska Wildlife Troopers. I think, though I'm not certain, my report is 6.7.3, perhaps?
Yes, it should be 6.7.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you for making that. Can I suggest, Steve, when each person comes up, that you remind commissioners of what the actual number is, because not everybody will be as well informed about what the number is.
Lucky guess.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Certainly. My report this year is similar to years past, but there are some key differences I'd like to point out. I think, I'm not sure if it was last year or the year before, I suggested that as part of the joint enforcement agreement we have with NOAA, and that those requirements may change, we may be better tracking halibut enforcement efforts on the recreation and charter fleet, and that did in fact come to fruition. So I was able to report some more direct numbers to you this year for sport and charter halibut versus years past where it was just sport fishing in general, which had salmon numbers lumped into it, which probably was of diminished value to you. I would like to point some things out. As the JEA has changed, as I've indicated in years past, for those of you that don't know, I'm sorry, the JEA is a joint enforcement agreement we have with NOAA. Years past, it was focused on almost entirely commercial halibut and sablefish. That's diminished now towards more sport and charter fishing has become more of a priority for us, as it has for NOAA. And we've supplemented those efforts with actual dockside monitoring of the sport and charter fleet whereas traditionally it was almost all just commercial offloads that we monitored. So with that, we were able to produce some of these numbers. The monitoring at the dockside for the sport and charter fleet is done almost all by commissioned staff, whereas the monitoring of historically the commercial offloads has been done by technicians, which were non-commissioned people. So the result of that, of course, is that we can take enforcement action immediately when violations are identified. The numbers that are on page 3 of my report, I believe, well, page 2 of the report if you don't count the title page. I would like to, you can see the numbers there for the different areas of the state, Southeast Alaska, Kenai Peninsula, North Gulf Coast, Western Alaska, and I would like to point out that Western Alaska for our numbers includes Kodiak. So you might assume that Western Alaska would be Area 3B, but it does include Kodiak, which is also part of 3A. Otherwise, those numbers wouldn't be anywhere near as high as they are because there's not that much charter and sport fish activity in 3B. If you look at the totals for the state, we had troopers documented 1,945 hours of halibut, sport fish, and charter enforcement efforts. They contacted 3,300 roughly fishermen, identified 105 violations in total, 65 were issued warnings, and 40 were issued citations. One thing I would like to point out about that is because the bulk of those numbers are done at the dockside, there are some of those numbers that I can't differentiate for you that were done near shore from vessels, but because most of those numbers are dockside, we wouldn't be able to document probably the most common violation out there for make it a boat limit, both in the sport and the charter fleet. I do have a breakdown for you there of some of the violations that were noted. And then below that I have the commercial IFQ halibut and statewide, I'm sorry, sablefish statewide efforts. And you would note, if you looked at previous reports, you'd note that those numbers are with the sport and charter fleet. I'm not able to break down those numbers between halibut and sablefish for you, so they're grouped together. What I did not include in the report, as I historically don't, are some of our undercover operations and undercover efforts in the past year. This past year, in 2012, we conducted a total of 5 undercover charter trips that included, at least in part, halibut fishing. All 5 of those trips are still pending. There's no convictions have resulted of those yet. In fact, some of them are continuing ongoing investigations. We haven't even closed our investigation yet. 2 of those 5 trips were with unlicensed operators. They didn't have a state guide license or halibut quota shares to be charter fishing with. One of those was a multi-day ongoing or multi-day trip in Southeast Alaska, and that trip resulted in a seizure of a 34-foot boat. That case is still pending. We hope to have that boat forfeited, and it's probably appraised value somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000. It's a very significant case for us. In addition to multiple halibut violations, it also included king salmon, personal use crab, shrimp violations, just what we would call a bandit. Well, at least in this venue we'd call a bandit. We have one other unlicensed operator that we investigated in South Central Alaska. That case is still pending. In fact, the investigation is still ongoing on that, so I can't give you too many details there other than boat limits, gaffing of fish, high grading of fish, all of those things occurred on that trip as well. Our 3 remaining trips, we had one that the investigation's concluded, though the case report's still at the prosecutor's office, so nobody's been charged yet. That was a multi-year investigation for us on a large operator that operates multiple boats, so they have multiple guides. So we conducted the operation over multiple years because we wanted to go to several different guides, so we wanted to determine if it was a business practice for the entire corporation or if it was just an individual guide in the corporation that was working outside the law. The reason we do that is because if we can determine that it's a business practice for the corporation, it ups the ante from a maximum of $10,000 fine for an individual. It goes up to a $250,000 fine maximum for a corporation. So hopefully charges will come from that soon, and the charges should be against the corporation. It seemed to be an ongoing business practice. In part because of suggestions from the commission here, we also this past year conducted 2 charter trips that were basically random. Get on the internet and book trips with operators that we have no information that they're of previous violations, no complaints from other operators, previous clients, other people, the public. So we conducted 2 of those trips. Both of them were in South Central. They were violated again, boat limits, catching skipper's fish, and in one case gaffing and high grading fish. So that is alarming to us. Last year I reported that we had our first, since I've been reporting to the commission, we had our very first undercover trip that did not result in violations, and now we're back to 100% violation rate in our charter fleet again this past year, in addition to 2 people that we didn't even have previous information that they were violators. So 2 people certainly doesn't make a sample set, but it's still alarming to us. And that kind of ties back to what I said earlier about the dockside checks, and that if you look at the violation rate, which would be fairly low, roughly 100 violations and 3,300 contacts, that's a pretty low violation rate, and we are not, obviously we're seeing a much higher violation rate than that in our undercover trip. So that's even further indicates that our dockside checks don't catch, you can't catch the boat limits because you're not there when, by the time they get to the boat, you don't know who caught what. I think that pretty much sums up what I had. Everything else is on paper for you, so whatever we have for questions.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Questions from commissioners? Paul?
Thanks very much for that comprehensive report. You have a challenging job in a big area to cover. I think we experience some of the same things in BC as well with our enforcement staff. And one of the questions that we ask quite commonly is, what are the trends? And wonder if you have any observations on that over the years.
Thank you, commissioners. Actually, I'm glad you asked that question because I have a big note to myself, trends, because I picked up on that yesterday, and I meant to include my statements about the violation rate among the charter fleet being near 100% as a trend that we've identified, at least with a limited sample that we can do every year. They're expensive to do, and budgets are what they are. So you know, we'd love to do more, but we can't afford to. But other trends, you know, I think it's the boat limit issue. I think is my personal belief. We don't have any data to support this, but I think it goes outside the charter fleet. I mean, it's easy to point the finger at the charter fleet for us, but of course, the charter fleet's the only boats we get on board to observe their practices on any kind of regular basis. I think the same behavior probably exists in the recreational fleet too. I think people go out, and if there's 4 people on board the boat, they know they can catch 8 fish, and they fish until there's 8 fish in the box and call it a day, no matter who catches those 8 fish. And again, you know, we don't have any data on the recreational fleet like we do with the charter fleet, because there's just no way for us to observe that kind of behavior.
Jim?
Thanks. Do you know of any other states or areas that I'm not sure what you call it, the undercover booking of trips that have done the same thing, and do they have 100% violation rates? California, Washington, Oregon?
Thank you, Commissioners. I know that other states, I know that California, Oregon, and Washington all have an undercover component to their enforcement. I could not speak to their violation rates. I know that NOAA has an undercover component, and I'm sure that Mr. Ante will speak to that more for you, or you could direct that question towards him. You know, it's an effective tool for us to use. It's also a very expensive tool for us to use, but every state that I'm aware of has an undercover component to their investigations, both for fishing and game both.
I guess the undercover person doesn't get a rebate on their fees for taking the charter or whatever it is in the first place. I can appreciate we do the same in Canada. We have an undercover operation as well. But the key thing is that the effectiveness of the information you get out of it. But then there's another process, which is the prosecution and side of it. Speaking of trends, do you see, what are the trends in prosecution of those? Are they quite successful on the whole, based on previous experience? Not obviously based because these are ongoing, the ones that you described from last year, but what's the, is it effective in resulting in successful prosecution, I guess would be the question.
Yes, Chair and Commissioners. Yes, it does result in successful prosecutions. I don't have, going from memory, I think we have a 100% conviction rate on our undercover trips where violations have been identified. Obviously, if we don't identify a violation, there's not going to be a conviction. But it is an effective way to prosecute cases as well, or gather evidence that leads to successful prosecutions. The difficulty sometimes on the prosecutorial side of things is it usually, depending upon how far in the whether it results in a court trial or at what point in the process a conviction comes of it, oftentimes it results in our undercovers being identified, which is problematic for us because it takes a tremendous amount of effort to develop those. You know, it's just part of doing business. We understand that, but you know, it's weeks worth of work to identify to build up an undercover identification, and you know, once that name's in the paper, you're starting from scratch all over again. So we do the best we can in our prosecutions to protect that, but the end result is if it happens, it happens. You know, it's the cost to get to prosecution. That's what we're there, or the successful prosecution. That's what we're there for.
Bruce, is there Ralph or Philip got any questions? Anybody else in the commissioners? Dave?
Thank you for a very interesting report, and I would just comment that your observations confirm my concerns around the data that we're getting out of this sector in both countries, and I know the Commission has had long-standing concerns with self-reported catch data. It's just not reliable. That's all. Just isn't. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. A question really for you, Bruce, in the context of other removals. Do we give an estimate of what we would call illegal fishing activity or the removals that come from that? How do we build that into the other removals part of the stock assessment process?
We do not, Mr. Chairman. There's no way for us to provide that kind of estimation in there. There's no way to do it, really.
Even looking at information over a number of years it's just too unreliable, I assume you're saying.
Mr. Chairman, let's give an example. If we took Captain Waldron's date on this kind of thing and applied it to the number of charter trips here, you could come up with some pretty interesting numbers, I'm sure. Whether or not they would be accurate is obviously a question.
Okay, thank you. Can I open it up to anybody else? Public otherwise who wishes to comment or ask questions? Can you just check one more time, make sure Philip and Ralph are not? Okay, thank you, Captain. That's great. Appreciate your time. Who's next?
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Ron Antea. I'm a supervisory investigator with NOAA Fisheries Office for Law Enforcement with the Alaska Enforcement Division. I'll get through this as quick as I can. The Alaska Enforcement Division of the National Marine Fisheries Service Office of Law Enforcement uses 4 strategies for compliance and enforcement. Outreach and education, which we now call compliance assistance. Patrols, which includes monitoring and inspections, investigations, and technology. Education and outreach, which is compliance assistance, is one of the things that we leaned heavily upon in 2012, with the thought being that if you can prevent some violations, it's far better than prosecuting the violations. In 2012, we invested a little over 2,000 hours in compliance assistance. This was done both in formal settings, 11 major events in Alaska and Washington, and also daily in the harbors and the ports and at sea when our officers are making their contacts. By far the quantity of contacts are made at the organized events, the state fairs, the fish shows and things like that, but my belief is the quality of the contacts really occur at sea, at the dock, when the officers have the opportunity to spend as much time as they need to with the anglers, answer all the questions, get out the charts if necessary, and really provide a quality experience in terms of providing regulatory information. In addition, that sometimes pays dividends in that the anglers provide us with some information that we can use then to investigate other people. Patrols is, which includes monitoring and inspection, is one of the large components. Of course, we engage in patrols, or a little over 5,000 hours of patrols last year dedicated strictly to halibut enforcement. But, we do this for a visible deterrence, to monitor the fishing and the other marine-related activities, of course, to detect violations, to conduct inspections, and, of course, for compliance assistance. I've provided some numbers for you here to take a look at. The 2012 numbers are in the columns on the right. And 2011 numbers are just to the left of that, so you can make some comparisons if you like. In the subsistence halibut fishing vessel sector, we conducted 17 inspections. There were 12 violations discovered during those inspections. In the commercial halibut fishing sector, this year we did 206 inspections. There were 16 violations discovered. You'll notice there's a significant drop from last year. That's due primarily to our reduced staff size and that staff being spread out over additional missions, other things that we are doing, marine mammals, things of that nature. In addition, as Captain Waldron mentioned, our partners, our joint enforcement agreement partners with the state of Alaska, they have reduced personnel as well, and the numbers certainly show that. We conducted 60 charter halibut fishing vessel inspections, 14 violations documented, 65 sport halibut fishing vessel inspections with 7 violations documented, and the 12 IFQ registered buyer or processor inspections. Those are actually 12 full audits, which include a complete look at all of the paperwork, basically fish in and fish out, and including looking at fish in inventory. It can get to be pretty extensive. It's a pretty big process. There were 5 violations documented. When we do a commercial boarding at the dock of a commercial halibut vessel and the fish is coming off, not only are we looking at the vessel, but we also look at the processor as well. In the U.S. IFQ fishery, the processor has the responsibility of reporting the weight of the fish, where the fish was caught, permit numbers, things of that nature. So every time we look at a commercial halibut offload, we're not just looking at the vessel, we're looking at the processor's compliance as well. As I indicated, we also conduct investigations. The investigations is certainly takes the bulk of our time. It can be a very long process. In 2012, we opened 439 cases total in Alaska,
and we documented 802 violations. Of those 802, 244 of them were halibut related, and the remainder were non-halibut related. Once again, a column on the right there, 2012, it tells you how many violations that we documented for each sector in Alaska, and I've provided the numbers for 2010 and 2011 as well, so you can see how things change from year to year. 39 subsistence violations, 95 commercial halibut fishing violations, 75 charter, 13 sport, 22 other halibut related. That's basically in the other ground fish, longline fisheries, failure to carefully release halibut, for a total of 244 halibut related violations documented last year. I don't know that I would call this a trend, but you can see that that's down from last year, up from the previous year. The thing I would point out there is, you know, I don't know that we can accurately track trends because our efforts vary from year to year so greatly. Depends on staffing, budget, other priorities, other missions, things of that nature. If we were able to invest the same resources into, say, halibut enforcement every year, we might be able to give you some accurate information about trends. But the fact is that our staffing changes every year, our priorities change, and it seems like we're always running around putting out different fires. As I indicated, there are, you know, violations in all sectors. Subsistence halibut fisheries, you know, some examples. It's the full gamut, everything from people not applying for a subsistence halibut registration certificate to gear violations, sale of or unlawful sale of halibut, and then exceeding bag and possession limit. The photo you see on the top right there, that is was taken this summer. It's a subsistence halibut fishing trip. One individual on board had 27 halibut. The bag limit is 20. So that person actually forfeited all those halibut to the Pioneer Home in Ketchikan. Commercial halibut fishing violations. Last year there were only 24 IFQ halibut overages, which is by far and away the lowest we've ever seen. The year before that there were 31, and the year before that there were 41. So the number's coming down. I think that's probably because fishermen are getting a little bit better at estimating their weights, and certainly lower catch rates mean that there's less margin for error there. Some of the other violations that we documented in the commercial sector this year are Area 4 clearance violations. The number of Area 4 clearance violations was up pretty significantly, and I think that's due to the fact that we changed the procedures and how we track those clearances. Of course, there's also the record-keeping and reporting violations, which are fishermen's logbooks, landing reports or misreports, things of that nature. Gear marking violations, undersized halibut, filleting, mutilating, hired skipper, vessel cap overages, and then a number of violations where people fished in an area where they didn't have IFQs or reported that they caught it in a different area. The photo you see on the lower right there, it's a load of commercially harvested halibut. A person went out fishing, didn't have any IFQs at all, none whatsoever. So it was, to be perfectly honest, pure dumb luck that we happened across this person, and we pulled their gear and we took their halibut from them. In the charter sector, of course, as I mentioned, there were 75 charter halibut logbook violations were documented. Logbook violations, a lot of logbook violations, a lot of them minor clerical errors. Filleting, mutilating, or skinning halibut on board, exceeding bag or possession limits. Captain Waldron mentioned this. He and I hadn't talked about this, but this year we did experience more reports and more first-hand accounts of both high grading and boat limits than ever before. I don't know if the practice is increasing or we'll just have a heightened sense of awareness, but certainly we saw it more often than we ever had in the past, and we've gotten more reports. Charter fishing without valid CHPs, line limit or angler endorsement limit, people exceeding that, captain and crew retention. A couple of these charter halibut violations, many of them are actually accompanied by logbook violations as well.
Obviously, if a guide's going to allow his or her client to exceed the bag limit, they're not going to write it in the logbook. So that compounds the problem. So many of the violations we see, there are actually 2 violations. And then, of course, the size limit violations in Area 2C, the top left photo you see there, it's a 47-inch halibut. As you're well aware, last year we had a U45068 reverse slot limit in 2C. For the most part, we tried to give the anglers the benefit of the doubt. We didn't hold them right to the line at 45 because we realize, I mean, it's a real world out there. It's difficult to measure a fish that's flopping around. So we try to give folks the benefit of the doubt. That's a 47-incher. I don't think we gave that person the benefit of the doubt. I think we ended up seizing that fish. And then, of course, sport fishing violations. There are actually very few regulations exceeding bag or possession limits. Once again, as Captain Waldron had mentioned, same thing, boat limits or party fishing and high grading, more reports this year than ever before. Once again, I don't know why that is. Filleting, mutilating, or skinning halibut on board a vessel. The lower left photo there, chunks of halibut fillets with skin off in Ziploc bags. You know, this is the thing we see every year. We see this, and there's a bag limit, there's a possession limit. We can't count how many fish the person has, so we end up seizing the fillets. Of course, we don't charge them with exceeding the bag limit. We charge them with not being able to count their fish. There were a couple of significant halibut investigations that came to conclusion in 2012 that I'd like to point out. All these investigations started quite some time ago. In 2012, Mr. Freddie Hankins was sentenced to 3 years probation in order to pay a $100,000 fine for falsely reporting where he harvested IFQ halibut. That actually started in 2007. He was finally sentenced this year. My understanding is that Mr. Hankins has started the appeal process with the U.S. District Court, and he wants to appeal his conviction. A $64,000 notice of violation assessment, that's a civil violation assessment, was issued to a fisherman out of Petersburg, Brian Candle, for harvesting a little over 10,000 pounds of halibut in Area 3A and reporting that he caught it in 3B. He just didn't go to 3B. A couple of fishermen out of Central and Far Western, Nikolai Yakunin and Christensen Laxfoss, were both ordered to pay fines of $3,000 and $2,000 and placed on probation for their roles in retaining, processing, and transporting halibut without the proper permits. That was, I believe it was about 650 pounds of fillets. I think we figured that out to be about 1,400 pounds of halibut that they ended up filleting and trying to sell illegally. A little over $19,000 notice of violation assessment was issued to Christopher Dutton and Aquatic Edge Expeditions for chartering an Area 2C without a charter halibut permit. In addition, he had chunked up halibut on board his vessel. My understanding is that Mr. Dutton also has asked for a hearing to appeal that civil violation. And a $30,000 NOVA was issued to Sidney Bouchard for charter fishing in Area 3A without a permit. That particular investigation started in 2011 with an undercover operation. It was information we had gotten. We put some people in there undercover, and a completely unlicensed guide took our undercover officers out fishing, caught halibut, no logbooks, no nothing. I don't know if he's paid that or not. While we're on the subject of undercover, I might as well say we did send some folks in undercover fishing this past summer in 2012. There were violations on every trip that those folks went on. That case is still pending. Once again, as Captain Waldron mentioned, it's very expensive and it's very time-consuming to send people undercover on a boat. It's something that we like to do. We'd like to do more often, but the resources don't allow it for as much as we'd like to do. The other thing that I'd like to mention on that, and it stems from a question that came up earlier, is prosecuting individuals as a result of undercover operations. We have found that we, in fact, have made the decision in the past at times to not prosecute individuals for relatively minor violations because we felt it was not worth giving up our undercover officer's identification. So, for example, if we go on board a boat and our officers fish for 5 days out of a lodge, and one day they exceed the bag limit on halibut. That's a situation where it may not be worth going after a person for what could be a $300 or a $500 civil violation. If for us to do that, we'd have to give up our undercover officers' IDs. It's not worth it for us, to be very honest with you. The use of technology, the only technology that's really available for us to use in the halibut fishery is VMS, Vessel Monitoring System. This is an edited screenshot for those that have not seen what VMS translates to in the office environment. This is what a person looks at, an enforcement tech or an officer looks at when they're looking at vessels in near real time. This is edited in that I've edited out all the vessel names. Normally the vessel names would be on there, and also I've superimposed the IPHC regulatory lines on there just for points of reference. The reason I show you this is that we, as I mentioned earlier, in Area 4, we had increased number of violations this year for clearance. We advocate VMS for any vessel that is fishing in Area 4. Of course, it's not regulatory at this point. We would like to see it become regulatory, but you can see here the advantages of VMS. Certainly, you know, the VMS signature, what you're looking at there is a bunch of little triangles. Each triangle is a position report. They're taken every 30 minutes or 1 hour, depending upon the polling rate that we've set. You can see where a vessel's at. Obviously, it doesn't tell you exactly what a vessel's doing, but you can infer by the position reports what a vessel might be doing. It's pretty clear when a vessel's traveling. For example, you can see there's a vessel traveling from the closed area straight into Dutch Harbor, straight line, consistent speed, pretty clear what that vessel's doing. You can see some of the other position reports where they're all sort of grouped together. This is over about a 10-hour period here. So all the vessel position reports are sort of grouped together. Certainly you don't know if they're fishing or not, but you can infer that they're at least in that area, and that's very helpful for enforcement purposes. That's about all I have. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Ron. That was good. Questions and comments, commissioners? Jim?
Mr. Chairman, Ron, what is high grading?
High grading, yeah, thank you. Sorry I didn't explain that earlier. It's a process where a person, it happens in both the sport fishery and the charter fishery, will catch a halibut, bring it on board the boat, maybe gaff it, maybe club it, leave it on the deck for a period of time, and go back to fishing and then catch a more desirable halibut, usually a larger halibut, and then let the first halibut go. Interestingly enough, this is not strictly prohibited under the IPHC or the federal regulations. The IPHC regulations say that any halibut that's brought on board a vessel in the sport fishery and not immediately returned to sea with a minimum of injury is considered part of the daily bag limit for that person. So if a person catches a fish, brings it on board, gaffs it, and beats it on the head, and it sits on the deck for an hour, and then they catch a larger one, and they let the first one go, they've caught 2 halibut for the day, and it's fine as long as they don't continue fishing. So it's something that we don't currently have a regulatory tool to combat, except in Area 2C in the charter fishery where the bag limit is 1. Yes.
Other questions or comments? Jim, do you have
If I could follow up, please. So clearly in the sports or charter thing, they can catch a fish and release it if they think they'll catch a bigger one, if they're careful and release it right away. So that's not high grading. It's when they retain it on boat and don't follow the regulations to put it back with a minimum injury as quick as they can.
Well, the term high grading is a term that we use. Basically, you know, it's referred to many different ways. I've heard some people call it upgrading.
So I'm trying to think what the I get it in the rec side and the charter boat side, but I'm not sure what the analog is in the commercial fishery.
Well, the analog in the commercial fishery might be that, to be honest with you, we have not caught anybody doing this in many, many years, where they catch a fish, let's say a halibut, that's a 20 to 40,
and they want to let it go because they want a 40 to 60 because they know they're going to get a few extra cents per pound.
Dave here, the commercial fisherman, agrees with that definition. Of course, he would never do that himself. Other questions from commissioners? Go ahead.
There's one question from Ralph Ford online, and I think he's referring to your table on page 2, Ron. And the question is, will this trend in reduced inspections continue? It's a very significant drop.
I would like to say no, but I don't have a crystal ball. I can tell you that we did recently hire 2 more enforcement officers. They recently finished their training. They are in the fields in both Seward and Homer right now, so our staffing is looking better for 2013 than it was for 2012. Our hope is to be able to continue hiring this year. We're not doing that until we figure out what the budget situation looks like. So the bottom line is we are in a better position in 2013 to do more than we did in 2014, or I'm sorry, 2012.
Paul?
Ron, how many enforcement officers do you have?
Thank you for asking. We have 11 enforcement officers in the entire state of Alaska. And we also have 9 special agents that conduct investigations.
Going to page 2, there's the table that you have there. You talked about the row that has IFQ buyer processor that was full audits.
Mm-hmm.
And so 2011 there were 17 inspections and 9 violations, and next year in 2012 there was 12 inspections and 5 violations. I guess so you've invested a lot of time in those, and it seems to be on the face of it a pretty high violations percentage, I guess, and it may be minor things or not, I don't know. I was wondering if you had any information on that, or what your views on whether you consider that a high violation rate.
Well, I don't know that I would consider it a high violation rate. I would say this. The processors they're held to a pretty high standard. They have volumes and volumes of regulations that they have to comply with. It's not uncommon for a processor to have a violation because they're so voluminous, and they are pretty complex, to be quite honest. They have federal regulations they have to comply with. They have state regulations they have to comply with. There are health standard regulations they have to comply with. These violations that we find in the processors here and that we document are relatively what I would consider big violations. So in other words, halibut that came in, that they purchased, that was resold, that, for example, was not reported for one reason or another. Either a tote got missed, or somebody transposed numbers, or in some cases, it's done on purpose. We think it's very important to invest the time and effort into auditing processors because, the fact of the matter is the bulk of the halibut that comes into the state of Alaska goes through the processors. That's where the greatest threat to the resource is, so that's where we put the bulk of our time in terms of actually looking at the inventory, the paperwork, and making sure everything's up to snuff. It doesn't surprise me at all if we find a violation, particularly if it's a clerical error, because, once again, it's pretty complex and there are a lot of regulations.
Other questions from commissioners? I have one, Ron, and this is sort of related to the reduction in capacity, which is an issue for us as well. So 2 questions related to that. One is, what's your general approach to how you triage your priorities? I mean, do you do it based on, what's the sort of general principles that you try to follow with respect to if you have fewer people to do it based on trends or other information? How do you kind of decide where to put those resources or where to commit the time? So that's the first question. And the related question is there also, or do you feel that there is sufficient what I would call deterrence under the regulation? So let's use the example of the guy, the bottom right corner photo you had of the unlicensed fisherman who you caught through blind luck, I think as you put it. Is the regulatory power not just to seize the fish, but also to seize the vessel, or to i.e. the cost of being caught? Is there a high enough deterrence factor, or do you see need for further regulation? This is, by the way, a question that would be applying in the Canadian context too. Fewer people who can investigate or do the violations, do we try to compensate, or would you recommend, or do you believe we need to compensate or look towards creating more deterrence or higher costs of being caught, let's put it that way?
Well, to answer your second question first, yeah, I would like to see a higher deterrence factor. I mean, as an example, I had mentioned earlier the fishermen out of Petersburg harvested a little over 10,000 pounds of halibut in Area 3A and reported it as being harvested in 3B. He paid a $64,000 civil assessment. Well, that's roughly the value of the fish. Yeah, he lost money. He had to pay his crew. He had to buy bait. He had to buy food, fuel, all that. But in my view, and this is my own personal view, this is not the view of, I'm sure, the government in general, I think that given the fact that it was the value of fish, it's not as much of a deterrence as it possibly could be. Once again, my own personal view. In terms of priorities, the Office of Law Enforcement does have priorities. There are stated priorities. We have both national priorities and divisional priorities. The priorities are set actually through the Federal Register process. We take input from stakeholders and our constituents, and we weigh out, you know, what everybody thinks is important, and we set our priorities. Our priorities are, the national priorities are extremely broad, you know, to protect and sustainable fisheries and protected resources. It's pretty much everything we do. The divisional priorities are far more specific and to the point. And we do have several divisional priorities that are targeted specifically at halibut-related fishing activities, particularly reporting and record keeping. Very high priority of ours to investigate violations of misreporting, things of that nature, because we understand that the reports that we receive both from fishermen and processors, that's the stuff that's used to manage the fishery. That's the important stuff. That's where we're putting a lot of our effort right now.
Thank you. Dave?
Ron, could I just ask you, I see in 2012 that you did 12 inspections of IFQ buyer processors. How many landing events were there in 2012, and what proportion is that the total audit of landings? I mean, is that?
No. That's the audit of the processor. That typically actually occurs when there are no vessels offloading, because to be perfectly honest, if a vessel's there offloading while we're trying to do an audit, it kind of messes things up. If we're trying to audit the amount of fish that's previously been taken into the plant, currently stored in the plant, and then has been shipped from the plant, kind of messes us up if there's fish coming in simultaneously. So these are done either early season or late season when there's no fishing activity, so we can get a full picture of what's happened in that plant up to that point. As I said earlier, when we monitor and offload a commercial vessel at the dock, we also do monitor what's going on at the plant. So, you know, I guess it's accurate to say that the total number of processor inspections we did would be 206 plus 12, but the 12 is complete audits of everything that went through the plant for a long period of time. We usually look at the previous year when we do this.
So I guess what I'm getting at is in terms of auditing the performance of the IFQ program and the compliance, the commercial halibut fishing vessel 206 inspections, that's what that is then in part. If a guy has a 10,000 pound quota, you're checking to make sure that he's not landing 12,000 pounds.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. You asked earlier how many offload events occurred this year. I don't have that number off the top of my head. I'm sure it's several thousand.
50,000, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, can I offer an opportunity for anyone else to ask a question? Please come to the microphone and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Henry Mitchell with Coastal Villages Regional Fund. I'm an Anchorage resident, and I do sport fish, and I occasionally go on charters. One thing I think that might help is if the charter operators were given the directive to basically, right at the start of their charters, to tell people what the limits are and how important it is to preserve these fish, and perhaps a good idea to issue some sort of a card to have people sign pledging that they're going to follow these rules. The better captains I know do that. The better captains that I know do not allow this hanky-panky. In terms of sports fishermen from Anchorage, there has been an upturn in illegal activity, and I suspect the reason for that is the price of halibut in Anchorage in the last few years has been $15, $19 a pound. Price of fuel is higher, and it is happening. And I just think it's a matter of the economy and the price of halibut. I don't know how you get a handle on that.
Mr. Chair, may I add something to that? Thank you for bringing that up. As you may or may not know, right now there's a federal regulation that indicates that a charter angler needs to sign a guide's logbook. And the regulatory language says that the guide has the angler sign, basically attesting to what he or she caught and has been put in the logbook is accurate. It's a great theory, but in practice, what our undercover people have told us is it doesn't really work that way. The way it really works is, for the most part, the guide hands the logbook over to the anglers and they say, here, would you please sign next to your name? And some anglers say, what's this for? And the guide will typically say, I don't know, the government just says you got to sign. Or another very common thing that will occur is guide will take anglers out fishing for the day, and logbook isn't filled out until they get back to the dock or maybe later in the lodge. And it's very common for a lodge staff to walk around during dinner or something like that and have the anglers sign the guidebook or the logbook while they're back in the lodge after the fishing's completed. And people are just signing. They don't know what they're signing. They don't look to see, you know, if the numbers are accurate. It's really not as effective as we had hoped, to be perfectly honest with you.
Thank you.
But I will also say, you know, there are a large number of really good guides out there. And, you know, I've been down on the dock, and I have heard guides tell everybody, these are the rules, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're not going to do, please don't ask me to do this because I won't do it. I've heard that many, many times.
One more thing. There are also individuals in Anchorage that have clientele lists that do not have licenses that sell fairly large amounts of halibut. This is all sort of undercover. They have boats, they keep them in Seward. This has been going on for years, and I suspect it's getting a little bit larger just because of the price that people in Anchorage have to pay for halibut. I don't know how you get a handle on that.
The only way is undercover fishing operations. It's the only way we can get at those sorts of things.
Thank you.
Just a comment from me. It's an experience we've been having in another fishery on the BC coast where we have challenges with our enforcement capacities to rely on industry actually to give us intelligence about what they're seeing, just has been provided there. And do you find that you can use that, or do you look for that, or you encourage that?
Well, absolutely. As I indicated earlier, when we do our compliance assistance, when we're doing the boardings, pretty much at sea or on the docks when there are no other vessels around, you know, we will linger, we'll strike up conversations, and we'll try to get as much information as we can about what's going on out there. Because, you know, to be honest, there's 11 of us, and there's thousands of anglers. We absolutely need information from the general public and the other guides.
Yeah, that's good too. Just one other thought, your point about not prosecuting where it's just not sufficient evidence or not worth it, as you say, to blow the cover. Would you consider, or do you consider, whether it's end of season or something, that you would have a conversation with the lodge owner, let's say, to say, look, you know, in past season we decided not to proceed, but we want you to know that you need to have a better handle on what you're allowing to have happen or not happen. Is that a practice you follow?
We do, but we don't do it overtly in that way. What we'll do is we'll send out letters to a large number of, say, guides or lodges, and we'll just say, as a reminder,
here's what you can do and can't do. We've seen these violations in general this past year. Please be a little more attentive in the next years. If we just send one letter to a particular lodge or a particular guide, we don't want to single that person out. We don't want to make accusations that we're not willing to follow up with.
Okay, thank you. Anything online, Bruce? Okay, thanks very much, Ron.
Thank you.
So let's try to do one more before a quick break. Bruce, who would be next? Chris? Okay, great. Which one are you doing first, Chris?
They're both combined.
Okay, so 6.7.1, and the other one is
4.5.1.
4.5.1. Okay.
Here, okay. Great. Thank you. My name is Chris Barrows. I'm a commander in the U.S. Coast Guard, and I'm stationed in the District 17 office, which is headquartered in Juneau, Alaska. My office in Juneau, Alaska controls the air and surface Coast Guard forces and enforcement efforts for all of Alaska. In this presentation, I'll be briefly touching on Coast Guard enforcement efforts and results, also in Area 2A, which is my 13th Coast Guard District colleagues. I have I think I have one slide that talks about their efforts and for the two derbies that they enforce with their colleagues. I'd like to start off by communicating that I'm relatively new in the Alaska region, reported in August, and I do find myself to be a little humbled by following my colleagues before me who have a lot more experience in specifically halibut fisheries and halibut, the IPHC and our federal enforcement. I have been involved in international fisheries and domestic fisheries for quite some time, but this is my first IPHC meeting, so hopefully I'll be able to provide you the information that that you like. Our enforcement efforts are primarily focused with aircraft and cutters, and we consider ourselves not to be a distinct entity. We consider ourselves to be very closely aligned and a part of the total enforcement package that the United States brings to bear in concert with our NOAA and state colleagues. And this is in existence, we consider this both in the 2A situation with the derby fisheries off of Oregon and Washington, as well as in a Alaska sense. So what that means is that we do coordinate our activities specifically with our NOAA Office of Law Enforcement colleagues. We focus on the intelligence that they receive in terms of charter and sport and commercial activities, and try to focus our enforcement efforts with our aircrafts and our cutters based on that information that we receive from them, including the NOAA BMS information too that our enforcement assets do see and utilize from a patrol planning standpoint. We don't just do boardings, though that is the primary way that we have contact with the fishing public. We provide a lot of information, though, in terms of the patrols and just the sighting information that we receive. And for example, some of that sighting information is used after the fact in NOAA investigations to be able to identify if people's logbooks are showing exactly where they did fish. And sometimes the Coast Guard sighting reports will be useful in helping to identify those investigations and reconcile that activity. So what do we focus on when we do go on board and make contact with the fishermen? Well, this slide identifies the primary things that we are looking at. Again, we much like it has been articulated in the colleagues before me, it is a snapshot of what we can see when we're on board. Not all of this information is immediately identifiable during the course of a boarding, but we do our best to try to make sure, one, that we have educated enforcement officers that know what to look for, and then two, when they're on board, that they're doing it in a respectful way, but also trying to be comprehensive in terms of being able to look at these types of activities and focus on making sure that that we're able to detect compliance and detect non-compliance. So here's the general statistics that we have, and this I selected a 5-year period just to try to identify some of the trends associated with our portion of the enforcement activity that we see. So what you see here is on the green bars are the number of boardings that have taken place over a 5-year period, and we had our highest number of boardings there in 2010. Even though we are in a downward trend with respect to that, we're still on par with the years before 2009. And then with the yellow bars being the violations that we've detected, and the blue line there is our estimate of a compliance rate. And I would caution that compliance rate is not indicative of the entire fishery, and I think some of the details and information that have come before me have identified some of the difficulties that enforcement as a whole has in terms of trying to comprehensively provide this information to you and try to provide a compliance rate in general. But what I would say is that this compliance rate is a measure of what the Coast Guard is able to observe during the boardings that the Coast Guard takes into effect at sea. So it does not, Coast Guard efforts aren't focused in a dockside manner. We're not focused in an investigatory manner. A lot of times we'll take the violations that we detect and we suspect, and we'll turn them over in case packages for them to be further investigated and looked into with our other colleagues. So I'm going to go through and break down in the different areas what we've seen, and here this is the information from my colleagues in District 13 in Area 2A, and this is obviously, as you know, this is different than the Alaska, our focus in Alaska, in that, or our efforts in Alaska, in that this is our efforts here are focused around 2 10-hour derbies, and in the context of them taking place in 2012, we did roughly the same number of boardings in each derby, 15 in one and 14 in the other, and we did find a violation for fishing after the closure occurred, which was relatively minor in terms of 20 minutes, which is why the warning was issued, and that was reflective of basically the operator believing that he had an extra 2 hours in the day to do that, to do his fishing than he actually did. At Area 2C, we had a total of 152 boardings broken up, with a large majority of them being recreational in nature, and then another 30 and 24 respectively being in the charter and IFQ categories. And our violations here were of the nature where the two charter boat violations were detected for failure to submit proper logbooks. As required. The commercial fishing vessel violations, one was a vessel who was written a violation for failure to maintain continuous transit with halibut on board following the closure of the halibut fishery. And so our this is another one where we cited the individual and turned the investigation over to NOAA Office of Law Enforcement for further follow-up. Another 2 violations in the commercial fishing category were cited for fishing, failing to fish, or cited for fishing without the required permit, so they didn't have that administrative paperwork on board. The recreational fishing vessel, that was an interesting violation in that it was a subsistence halibut fisher who we had information that he was fishing with too many hooks. And in the process of boarding that vessel, he actually cut his line in an attempt to try to keep us from being able to actually count the hooks that he had soaking. While he was hauling the gear, basically letting that gear go. So we seized the remaining gear on board his vessel and also then turned that entire gear and package over to the Office of Law Enforcement for further investigation. So in Area 3A, we had a total of 47 boardings that took place, with one violation for cited for failure to use the required seabird avoidance gear. So this was an issue of enforcing compliance with other bycatch issues. And in Area 3B, we had a relatively small amount of boardings, 4 boardings total in the IFQ sector with no violations detected. In Area 4, we had a total of 16 boardings with also no violations detected. This is an area where we are going to try to put a little bit more emphasis in terms of focus on boarding halibut enterprises in the 2013, and so we hope to increase our boarding numbers here. We had no boardings in Area 4E, so that's a pretty easy one to report for you. And it's relatively a short focus for my presentation. Again, I focused it on the results of our efforts. The number of assets that we have are detailed more specifically and more pointedly in the reports, both for District 13 and District 17, but they're very similar to years past. So I don't have any anomalies or any specific additional information that I think I need to provide for those that have seen the previous presentations. I would like to say that the use of vessel monitoring systems and the information that we get from that was articulated, and you were able to see a VMS screenshot in the previous presentation. The Coast Guard does use VMS when we have it available for patrol planning. We find it invaluable in terms of our abilities to target the activity on the water with our patrol craft and our aircraft, and it allows us to be a lot more efficient in terms of what we do. So we have 11 statutory missions, of which fisheries enforcement is one of those 11 statutory missions, and one of the things that I'd like to take a look at in terms of how we do our operations is the efficiency that we're able to do that with. And of course, using technology like VMS that helps us focus our efforts is part and parcel to being efficient at sending our assets out. The other thing that I'd like to comment on is, and this did come up a little bit more specifically in the NOAA's presentation to you, is I think it would be useful in the future to add some relationship with the contact and how much contact rate we are having with the fishers that are out on the water from a vessel perspective and maybe a trip perspective. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking at to try to incorporate to be able to provide to you in future years, is not only the effort that we've done and the results that we see from a boarding and a violation standpoint, but then also how that may translate in terms of the number of contacts that we're having at sea. So I'm open to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Chris. Commissioners, questions or comments? Jim?
What vessel is that, Chris?
That one is one of our new offshore patrol craft vessels, and or actually a fast response vessel, and we're hoping to have within the next 5 years. We don't have any of these in Alaska right now. They are replacements for our 110-foot patrol vessels with their island class. We are looking to get 6 of these, I guess, at the end of a 5-year period in Alaska. Yep, and in fact, Alaska will be the first district on the West Coast to receive these new vessels. They're already being rolled out on the East Coast. I think a number of them in Key West and Miami, but they're in production, and I think in about 2 years we should see our first one coming up to Alaska, and that'll be again the first one on the West Coast, and for a total of 6.
You said it's replacing 110 footers, or is 110?
No, it's larger than 110 footer, 10 foot. So we hope that it has greater sea keeping capacity, and with that, a better ability to get maybe to some of the areas that we don't typically patrol, specifically from a fisheries standpoint, or because of the capability of the island class, the 110 foot. But hopefully this will be able to get out a little bit farther into the Gulf of Alaska and also into the Bering, which is part and parcel to why I mentioned that our efforts in future years, particularly with the receiving this particular class of vessel and our ability to get out into the Bering Sea and have a more sustained presence in the Bering Sea, we hope to see increases in.
With a strengthened hull, I guess, to deal with ice issues, is that? Did they get adjusted for that reality of what it must be up there?
It's still pretty thin. I think it's larger. It's greater than the Island Class 110-foot patrol boat, but there's not much that's smaller than the Island Class 110 patrol boat's hull. Having served on one, it's fairly thin hull. So that is definitely a condition that we are concerned that we have, particularly with our current patrol boats that are patrolling out of Valdez and Seward. There's times in the year where they simply just can't get underway from the dock because of the ice conditions. So.
Paul?
Chris, how fast is fast on those boats?
25 plus knots, I think, is the unclassified statistics or characteristics that is being published for them.
Say on page 1, and you mentioned it too, and so did Ron in his presentation about the VMS, and is there consideration for making that mandatory, do you know, or?
I would let my NOAA colleagues take that. From a Coast Guard perspective, we're a user of VMS data, and the statutory language in our domestic legislation specifically allows the Coast Guard to use it for search and rescue purposes and fisheries enforcement, and then it broadens the use of VMS data for Homeland Security purposes, which quite frankly is not that we don't use that from a significant standpoint in the Alaska context. It's primarily for fisheries and search and rescue. But as a user of it, we don't own the program and the expansion of it, but we are certainly a proponent for that in the domestic context.
Anything else? Ralph or?
A question from Commissioner Lestenkoff online. Is there a specific reason for the Coast Guard's goal to increase boardings in Area 4, e.g. marine safety, compliance concerns, etc.?
Well, I think it's one of general of contact. When we do go on board vessels, we're not just boarding from a fisheries enforcement standpoint and a compliance standpoint. We're looking at all applicable federal laws, and primary in that, specifically in a fisheries context, and this is nationwide in addition to Alaska, is for safety gear. So we do board because when a search and rescue case that we can avert is the best type of search and rescue case that we can have. And we are a strong proponent of ensuring and trying to again, convince the boating public and the fishermen of the necessity of the safety gear that they have, and to make sure that that they're keeping it in serviceable condition. So part of the reason that we do want to get on board fishers in the Area 4 area is to enforce our safety requirements and increase compliance with that, and try to avert search and rescue cases. But it also does have a component of compliance with fisheries regulations as well.
Philip, if you can hear me, you should arrange with Chris to get yourself on a cruise this summer with the Coast Guard cutter. Dave, did you want to ask a question? Okay. Any other commissioner questions? Okay. Anybody else who'd like to ask a question? Good. Thanks very much, Chris. Appreciate that. So I think, Bruce, Jim, should we take a quick 10-minute break? And who's up next after the break? Okay, that's good. So tee those people up to be ready for after the break. Thank you. Okay, so our next presentation is subsistence harvest in Pacific halibut. 6.6, and I think actually commissioners were given a copy of the presentation as well just now. So please proceed.
Good morning. My name is Jim Fall. I work for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and I'd like to provide a brief overview, an update of our estimates of subsistence halibut harvest in Alaska. Again, there is a tab 6.6 is our 4-page executive summary of our longer report, and I also provided the commissioners with a paper copy of my PowerPoint presentation. This project is conducted by the Division of Subsistence of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game with funding through a grant from the National Marine Fisheries Service. There is a longer technical paper with the full results of the study that was provided to Commission staff and is also available online. Some background on the program. New subsistence halibut fishing regulations came into effect in Alaska in 2003, in May of 2003. Residents of 118 rural communities and 123 Alaska Native tribes with customary and traditional uses of halibut are eligible to participate in the subsistence halibut fishery, plus residents of designated rural areas. These are people who don't live within the city boundaries but are still participating in the fishery. In order to fish, you must register with NMFS and obtain a subsistence halibut registration certificate, which is called a SHARC or a SHARC card. The regulations that were adopted by the Council provide for the collecting of subsistence harvest data. The report that I'm giving now covers the 9th year of the harvest assessment program. That's harvest in 2011. And funding in this past, for 2011, included funding for a third mailing and outreach in certain communities in Area 2C. How we do the work, most of it is through a mailed one-page survey mailed to every shark holder. Response is voluntary to the survey. There were 11,145 individuals who held sharks for at least, that were valid for at least a portion of the 2011 study year. We do 3 rounds of mailings, and we supplement the mailings with household contacts in selected communities that traditionally have high levels of subsistence halibut harvest. There were 5 of those in 2011: Sitka, Angoon, Heidelberg, Ketchikan, Metlakatla. That work is facilitated through contracts with the tribal organizations in those places. Our sample achievement for 2011, we have about 7,600 surveys returned of the 11,145 shark holders. That's a sampling fraction of 68%, and as detailed in the full report, we achieved high rates of return, 70% or more, in most of the larger communities with the most sharks issued. And a trend in the survey achievement, 68% for 2011 was the highest return rate that we've had in the 9 years. This graph shows the total number of shark holders for each study year. That's the total bar, and then the dark portion of the bar is how many surveys we got back. And the long-term average is 62%, but it was 68% in 2011. Our findings in a nutshell, we estimate that about 4,700 individuals participated in the subsistence halibut fishery in Alaska in 2011. They harvested about 38,000 halibut for about 700,000 pounds net weight. 55% of that harvest occurred in Area 2C, Southeast Alaska, 38% in Area 2A, which is South Central Alaska. Most of the harvest, 77%, was taken with set lines, skates, with the remainder taken with handheld lines or rod and reel. Let's look at some trends quickly. In terms of participation in the fishery, our estimate of about 4,700 fishers, subsistence fishers, was the lowest for the 9 years. The average over the 9 years is about 5,400 fishers. I'm going to skip that one. The estimate of the harvest of 700,000 pounds is the lowest estimate for the 9 years and continues a trend of lower harvests in the subsistence fishery that began in approximately 2006, as shown in this slide. The 9-year average, actually the 8-year average, the previous 8-year average was about 1 million pounds net weight in the subsistence fishery. So 2011 was about 30% below that long-term average. In terms of the number of halibut harvested, 38,000 is again the lowest that we've had. The trend downwards has been not as steep for the total number of halibut harvested, because the average weight of a halibut in the subsistence fishery has also declined over time, which is shown in the next slide. And what we saw in terms of average weight for the first 5 or 6 years of the fishery, actually from 2003 through 2008, the average weight, net weight of a halibut in the subsistence fishery declined by about a pound a year statewide. Since 2008, we've basically seen a leveling off at the statewide level at between 18 and 19 pounds per fish. The next slide, the pie diagram, shows where the harvest occurred in 2011, about 55% in southeast Alaska, 38% in south central, and then smaller slices in of the pie in the remainder of the state. And that pattern is also has been typical for the 9 years of the monitoring of the fishery, with 2C and 3A accounting for between 85 and 94% of the total subsistence harvest in Alaska. In terms of the overall removals in the halibut fishery in Alaska, the subsistence harvest accounted for 1.4% of the total removals in 2011, and since 2003 the subsistence fishery has accounted for between 1.1 and 1.4% of those total removals. The highest percentage that subsistence represents in any of the regulatory areas is in 2C, which was 8.5% in 2011. That was the highest percentage in 2C for the 9 years. We did do an analysis of shark renewal patterns. If you are a resident of a rural place that's eligible, you must renew your shark card every 2 years. If you're a member of an eligible tribe, it's every 4 years. About 21,000 individuals have held a shark card for at least one term since 2003, and 47% of them have not renewed. They no longer have active sharks. And that includes 34% who had reported to us that they had fished. But what we found in this analysis is that people who had not renewed their cards were more likely than those who are still actively engaged in the program to have not responded to our survey at all, to have not fished, or to have had lower harvests. And the next graphic basically shows that, where if you look at the second set of bars, 29% of the shark cards that have expired, they never reported fishing to us, while those who have active sharks now, 10%, only 10%, have never fished. So what this basically shows is that early in the program, a number of individuals obtained shark cards because they were interested in perhaps trying out the fishery and never did. We also know that there was a policy for a number of Alaska Native tribes to sign up everybody in the tribe, including 2-year-old kids and 90-year-old people, and that did not happen in subsequent rounds of renewals. It narrowed down more to the people who were actually engaged. in the fishing. So we've seen some settling out, basically, of the program since the beginning that is indicated in this analysis. So to conclude, for 2011, again, the 9th year of this program, we think that the harvest survey was a success this year. We got really good response rates overall. We got good response rates in the large communities and the large tribes that take most of the fish. We believe that our estimates statewide and for 2C and 3A especially are quite reliable compared to past years in our understanding of trends. We now can discern some general trends in the subsistence fishery after 9 years. We do recommend at the end of our report that the harvest monitoring continue, that we continue to partner with Alaska Native tribes to supplement the mailings in selected places, continue outreach, and we should consider some expanded outreach perhaps in Area 4 where the number of shark cards and registrations has dropped off. We think if there's an area of the state where we're probably underestimating the subsistence harvest, it's probably in Area 4. We are now have just begun the 10th year of the study. The current grant between the department and NIMS was amended so that we can document the harvest for 2012. The methods will be the same as we've used in past year, 3 mailings and interviewing in selected communities. We've already begun outreach. The first mailing took place a couple of weeks ago. We already have several thousand surveys back, and we're busy doing the data entry right now. There is no funding in place beyond the 10th year. That we basically obtain funding year to year in this program. And to conclude, for more information, our final report and our 4-page executive summary are available at the department website. Paper copies are available from us, or the full report can just be downloaded from ADF&G. And it's also available, I believe, through NIMS and through the commission staff. And Mr. Chair, with that, that concludes my report.
Thanks, Jim. Comments or questions from commissioners? Any from Philip or Ralph? Jim?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim, does any element of the outreach or other method verify the weights, or where do the average weights come from that you got, and how does that calculate and go into the total volume harvested?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Balsinger, the survey itself asks the respondent for the number of halibut that they harvested and their estimate of round weight. So in both cases, our weights from the monitoring each year are based upon recall and self-reporting from the shark holders. In 2006, I believe it was, NIMS did fund a in-season monitoring program, and we worked with halibut fishers in the 2 largest eligible communities, Kodiak and Sitka, where we asked them to keep logs, which we collected weekly from May through September of 2006. So we could check the estimates of total harvest in numbers and in pounds, as well as average weight against what we were getting from recall and from the mail-out. And in terms of the average weight of a fish, there was no statistically significant difference between the average weight of a fish from the in-season monitoring program and from the mail-out. So that boosted our confidence that overall subsistence fishers can do a pretty good job at reporting what they take each year. We found that many subsistence fishers have goals for providing for their families and those that they share with. A lot of subsistence fishers actually keep logs on their boats too, keep records. So.
But do you think in either case that any of these halibut have ever been weighed? or do they just know how much they weigh, and so whether they reported in the logbook, yep, that was a 20-pounder, or whether they reported it in the survey at the end, yeah, I caught a 20-pounder, or do you think some of them actually got put on a scale?
I think most are not being weighed, but I think in many cases people measure them. They get weights.
Other comments from one from Philip?
Question from Philip. Do you know what, if any, is the penalty for subsistence fishing with an expired shark permit? Mr. Chair, I'm not involved in the enforcement aspect of this, but I'm sure somebody could tell us that's perhaps in this room. But I don't know.
Do you know who would be responsible for the enforcement? Is it NOAA or is it?
NOAA or the troopers.
Do you know, Glenn, the answer?
Okay.
Well, so no enforcement would be responsible. So. Thank you, Commissioners. No enforcement is responsible for shark card enforcement, although they are, I believe this is cross-deputized with Alaska State Troopers as well. So if there are specific issues, then both of those agents could.
The general question was, do you have an idea of what the penalties are or what the general sort of regulation is with expired, if you're caught with an expired one? What?
Right, and I don't have that penalty schedule, and I'd have to consult with NOAA General Counsel on how that works.
So maybe we could record or arrange just to provide that information to the commissioners based on. Another question from?
Further question from Philip.
Yep.
Any guess on the reason the annual amount of harvest has been decreasing? I think that the reasons are complex. One thing is that overall effort is down. I think in part it's part of that settling out of the program and talking to people. A number of people have told us that they didn't renew because they had not participated previously in the subsistence halibut fishery. They wondered what it would be like to set out a skate and harvest halibut efficiently, and they found out that it was a lot of work. And so they also found out that 2 or 3 halibut was fine for their family, and they could do that under a sport fishing license, and so they didn't renew. So that happened. So I think there's a real decline in participation in harvest through that. What we also learned is that there is lowered success rates in a number of areas, especially in 2C, that people are just harvesting less halibut per effort. I don't think that it indicates less interest on the part of those communities that have traditionally used the resource for subsistence. There's no evidence of that. I hope that's responsive to the question.
Thank you. Anything else from Philip or Ralph? Not so far. Okay. Paul?
Jim, what are the criteria for applying for subsistence, or can anyone apply? What are the criteria?
You must either be a member of one of the 120 plus Alaska Native tribes who have customary and traditional uses of halibut. So you must be on the tribal rolls and be able to demonstrate that to the RAM division of NIMS. And that's only a portion of the Alaska Native tribes. There's over 200 Alaska Native tribes, but many don't have traditional uses of halibut, so the council did not include them on the list of eligible tribes. The other way that you can participate is you must be a resident of one of the 118 rural communities that were found by the council to have customary and traditional uses of halibut. So you must be able to demonstrate that you are domiciled in that place. If you move from an eligible place, let's say from Petersburg or Sitka or Angoon to Anchorage or to Juneau or to Fairbanks, and you're not an eligible tribal member, you no longer hold a valid shark card. Your shark card would be invalid. Those are the 2 ways to do it.
Okay, thanks. So they can harvest other species, I would assume, and I guess the question, and so if they're out on their card, they could harvest salmon. Do you notice the same trends as far as decreases in amounts, or is there shifting of effort to catch others? It's beyond your report, I know, but I just thought maybe you know.
The silence is that I'm thinking. Okay. Well, for one thing, the incidental harvest in the subsistence halibut fishery for rockfish, lingcod, salmon would be governed by state of Alaska subsistence fishing rules, not the rules for the halibut fishery. For example, the Alaska Board of Fisheries amended its regulations for rockfish and lingcod to allow those that are taken in the legal federal subsistence fishery to be retained for subsistence use up to the established bag limit. That was important because Alaska subsistence regulations for lingcod or for rockfish don't necessarily allow for use of long lines. So that was an important change. Overall, in the Alaska subsistence salmon fisheries, it's really variable in terms of long-term trends. In some areas, Bristol Bay, Alaska Peninsula, Chignet, Kodiak, we really see steady subsistence harvests of salmon. In areas further north and west, the trend has been down, but not because of disinterest or lack of need, but because of poor returns. So it's a complex question that varies by area.
Right. Okay, thanks, Jim.
Any other commissioner questions? Dave?
Just a couple. What's the limit on subsistence harvest of halibut? Annual limit, or what kind of limits are there? And what are the regulations around what sort of vessel that you need to use? Does it have to be your own vessel? Can you rent a vessel? Can you, that sort of thing?
Mr. Chair, on the second question, I'll have to pass to someone who's more knowledgeable about the details of the regulations regarding vessels. Regarding the limits, there's no annual limit anywhere for the subsistence halibut fishery. For most of the regulatory areas, there's a 20 fish per day daily bag and possession limit. That is not west and the north. The average catch in a trip is a little over 2 fish, though. But I'm not sure about the vessel rules.
So this isn't a question. It's perhaps new to Mr. Boyes and Mr. Ryle, but they're sharing. There's no selling of the subsistence fish, but there is sharing across tribes. Junkie gives rules. So if a person catches 20, he may give some to grandmas and aunts and cousins and the person across the street and those kinds of things. So, but the compensation is not allowed. So.
Jim?
Thanks, Jim, for pointing that out, because that is the basic explanation for why that daily bag might seem so high. I believe the council considered some kind of proxy of bag limits, but it decided that the paperwork involved in that was really unnecessary, and it was more important just to recognize that there are the specialists, especially in the village, who provide for extended families and others who can't fish for themselves, and that's what that was intended to do.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from commissioners? I just have one, Jim. The slide 7 on the estimated subsistence harvest, close to 700,000. So that is based on an extrapolation of the survey, I assume, right?
Mr. Chair, that is correct. We expand up from our returns to estimate
the overall amount.
The overall amount.
And then that is further, I assume, broken down by regulatory area. You mentioned the next bullet, 55% of the harvest is in TC. So 55% of that 697 would be, is that correct?
That's correct, yes. Yeah, our sampling units are rural communities and tribes. Right. So the complete report provides an estimate for every tribe, every rural place, every place by residents, and then by place fished.
Right.
We sort it in different ways.
Paul?
Jim, maybe I'm reading between the lines, but on slide 19, and you mentioned this about the current grant between ADF&G and NIMS is amended to document 2012 subsistence harvest. So what about going forward?
That's up to the National Marine Fisheries Service to amend the grant for documenting 2013. We've basically done it year by year.
Okay.
And so far there's been support for the program. I think in general the usefulness of the information has generally been acknowledged, but it's a year-to-year decision.
So we haven't quite done this yet, but we're probably going to ask Dr. King what would happen if we did it every other year. For example, after we've got 10 years in, budget realities are realities.
Would you like to answer that? Just forecasting.
I'm just for the commission, you know, just because it's gone 10 years, I think we're going to have to make trade-offs on groundfish surveys. We probably can't do those every year. Stock assessments that we've done annually now for 35 years, we'll probably start doing those on a staggered basis. Just because of the budget problems, and this is something, and there's some consistency in the trends and in the sizes, so it may be something that we don't lose all that much if we do every other year. That's not a decision that's been made, but we're looking at those kinds of things for all of our programs. So I just didn't want to leave you the impression that for certain we would have this every year going on.
Don't worry, that's our real-life experience too, right? Yeah, Paul? You have another question, Paul?
No, yeah, I just echo. I mean, we're similar considerations as well, Jim, for sure.
Any other commissioner questions? I should know this answer, but is there a size limit imposed on the subsistence fishery, or is it open-ended?
Mr. Chair, there's no size limit.
Right. Okay. Anybody from anyone else who wishes to comment? Question? Please come to the microphone.
Hi, it's Devona Adams from DFO in Vancouver. Just wondering if your tribal members fishing in a sport fishery are required to have a license and subject to the same limits as the regular sport fishery?
Mr. Chair, yes. Tribal members in Alaska must have a sport fishing license if they are indeed sport fishing for halibut or any other species. Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, thanks, Jim. Appreciate that. So what's next, Bruce?
Mr. Chairman, we have two other items in this agenda section. The first one was just an information item. That's the IPHC report, so it's in your books under tab 6.5.
That's fine. Okay.
And the last one was we have inserted the letter that we received back from North Pacific.
We had inserted a letter we received back from the North Pacific Management Council on the Bering Sea closed area, and I don't know if you needed or wanted to revisit that. There was some discussion of this at the interim meeting.
That letter was received earlier than the interim meeting, was it not, though?
It was, Mr. Chairman.
So we did cover the issue at the IM, if I recall.
Yeah.
So is there anything new that needs to be, Jim, did you want to comment at all on that?
Mr. Chairman, I don't. This, as you recall, or maybe you don't, over years, Commissioner Lestenkoff had interest in this. There's a number of other issues that I think are overriding this, and so it's kind of gone on the back burner. It certainly still is an issue, but I don't think that, unless Philip tells us differently, I don't think we're working on it right now. There's other things we're trying to get done, so I think we don't need to deal with it unless Philip has a different point of view.
How fast can you type, Philip? Let us know whether you want to ask anything about that. Where is it in our book? What number? 6.8, right.
Mr. Chairman, I just got an I agree from Commissioner Lestenkoff.
Okay. So I think we were hoping to have, how much time do we have here? We have about half an hour before we're scheduled to break for lunch. and we were hoping to be able to start on, I think, the research discussion, if commissioners agree, before we break. So I guess are there two components to this, Bruce, the annual plan and the 5-year plan? How would you like to proceed?
Your choice, Mr. Chairman. The RAB report is also there for you as an informational item in the first tab on this. If you wish, we can do the 5-year plan first and then move to the annual plan. It might be a logical sequence.
Do you agree, Jim? Any commissioners, any issues with that? I think people could ask questions or comment on the RAB report, maybe in the context of responding to the information on the annual and the 5-year. So please please proceed. I would like to have, I know they're not in the room right now, or I don't see Ian Stewart. Is Ian able to be part of this discussion?
He and Steve are up talking to the conference board right now. Well, Steve is here. Okay. Sorry.
Steve's here.
Steve Martell is here. We have 4 Steves on staff.
Yeah. SM's here. Okay, please, Bruce.
Maybe I'll.
So this is in section 7, right?
3.3, Mr.
Oh, it's 3.3, this one. Okay. Yeah, the RAB 7.1.
Right. Nope. 5-year research plan, 3. This one here, 5-year research plan. Thank you. Okay. Oh. Okay. Mr. Chairman, this is a minor update on what I had. The document itself is more extensive than was presented to you at the interim meeting and our planning meeting in September. The presentation itself is slightly enhanced from the. Broadly speaking, the mandate of the Commission is, from its research perspective, is defined by the convention. Just done in the italic section here. The core objective of Commission research is to themes, but the process of research development is what we've been dealing with as a result of the performance review and also discussions we've had in with you in a previous year's meeting. So the approach to this would be the 5-year research plan will be updated biennially. There's an annual research plan that's initially developed by the staff to align the research with a 5-year plan. The candidate research proposals will be reviewed by the Research Advisory Board and then the Scientific Review Board. The proposals that are endorsed by the review process would then be presented to you for your consideration, modified where required, prioritized, and approved. And then there would be an annual review of the research progress prepared by the Commission, which is normally done through our RARA. The 4 main research themes that we identified previously were stock identification, monitoring, assessment and forecasting, and incorporation of uncertainty, development and evaluation of appropriate management strategies, including harvest rates and all the associated tools that go along with that, advancing the understanding of the biology of the species, including growth, spawning, movement, migration, natural mortality, etc., and an understanding of the ecological context for halibut, including many things in feeding, predation, environmental effects, ecosystem effects. So each one of these research themes has primary objectives, and then under those primary objectives are various projects. In the written version of this, we have some discussion about the sort of enduring nature of the 4 research themes and somewhat more dynamic primary objectives, and then the tools, the actual projects themselves would be the things that would be annually assessed and changed as Commission needs might see that. But in terms of primary objectives, the stock identification, monitoring, assessment, and forecasting, the main issues around stock structure and identification is simply understanding the stock structure of halibut. Are there some components of the stock that we need to be aware of and to respect when we generate our management plans? Then we also need to understand the influence of age, sex, and size movements as they relate to stock components. From a perspective of stock monitoring, this is one of the fundamental building blocks that we use in trying to understand the stock, so we need to be collecting statistically reliable data. We have an annually fishery independent coastwide setline survey that ends up being a fairly profound contributor to our understanding of the stock and its dynamics. We also need to monitor the pre-recruit portion of the stock and collaborating with other agencies. This is where we put people on some other agencies' research vessels, in particular in the Bering Sea, looking at the abundance of small fish in some of these areas and trying to relate this to incoming recruitment. Ian will be doing a lot more work in trying to incorporate much of the effort on juvenile fish into the stock assessment itself. We also need to develop collaborative programs for participation research with other agencies. We obviously are a small agency and we don't have the tools available to us that some of the larger agencies are due. So we work very closely with particularly National Marine Fisheries Service in Alaska, which is a large area of halibut occurrence, to gather critical data on the stock through their tools and participating with them in programs. We need to ensure that we have adequate sampling of our fisheries and maintenance and archiving of all those data in a much more strategic sense. From the stock assessment perspective, obviously we need to conduct the assessment, forecasting current and forecasted abundance and trends, as well as estimates of uncertainty in them, to determine and reduce the level of uncertainty associated with our stock assessments. That's been one of the major undertakings that we've done with your guidance in the last year, and will be an ongoing process. The undertaking of the peer review process is something that the staff is pretty keen to get going on the Scientific Advisory Board. You will have, in other parts of your briefing book, you have the outline that we've edited since our interim meeting and what the Scientific Review Board might look like for your consideration, and certainly the staff would like to see us get underway with this as quickly as we can. We're envisioning this as a sort of a commission-constituted body as opposed to the sort of changing with reciprocal domestic bodies to go through a review process. We think that it would be useful to have the continuity from an internally based review body for the commission. And then the last part is scientific information being provided in a way that's understandable for use and useful for management authorities and the public. The second primary theme is development of management strategies, and this is the work that Steve Martell and the MSAB will be looking at over the next while as far as the Commission is concerned. One of the things we want to do is evaluate management procedures against a background operating model to try and understand without putting the fishery in peril in the real sense, but to actually be doing this through simulation work with as best an understanding of the operating models we can provide. We also need to be providing harvest management advice to the Commission and user groups in a form which allows the consideration of uncertainty, and our first step was the decision table you saw this year. And the management strategy evaluation in conjunction with the user groups to try and come up with optimum management measures and to address conservation and economic goals. Research theme 3 was understanding the biology of the animal, and in this there are several components, and primarily looking at the biology, physiology, and ecosystem interactions. We need to be looking at changes in the halibut itself, particularly size at age, and we did give you a presentation during our public session and some of the research that we proposed under funding from the North Pacific Research Board. We also, because of the complex nature of interactions in species in the North Sea Pacific, need to cooperate and collaborate with other institutions to obtain the biological and ecosystem information, and we've reached out to some of those agencies as part of this process of looking at size at age this year. Another very significant part of this is looking at ontogenetic and seasonal movements of halibut, particularly by size, sex, and age. They clearly have major impacts on understanding yield from the halibut resource and its dynamics. One of the things we want to be looking at is deriving some more finely resolved estimates of the impact of upstream removals. This has been an ongoing theme for the Commission to try and understand that. We want to look at evaluating the impact of exploitation patterns on the distribution of stock biomass relative to this sort of historical unfished thing. One of the things we're looking at on the long term is trying to have consistent harvest rates for the animals throughout their experience of the fishery in order to guard against uncertainty about reproductive contributions, etc. We'll be looking at continuing the evaluation, the impact of fishing seasons on inter-area interceptions. This is a key feature of some areas where we have a lot of movement of fish during the spawning season, and having them intercepted through fisheries there can have some significant long-term effects for it. I think the major projects that are going to be associated with these sorts of things are going to be some of the things like our archival tagging, but also much more detailed investigation of some of our historical data on this. The fourth theme on this is understanding the ecological context of halibut, and here we're looking to understand the relationships between environmental influences and halibut distribution and behavior, to annually look at relevant environmental variables with IPHC research platforms. This is looking at our water column work and also cooperating with other agencies to get environmental information that we use in our projections. As you know, we have used historically the fluctuation in the Pacific Decadal Oscillation as one of the components of our harvest policy. I think that still is a very important thing, and I know Steve Martell will be looking at this very intensely, as well as looking at the normal stock recruit functions that you normally use in management strategy evaluation. And then the last part of this is collaborating with other researchers on assessing influence of environmental and ecosystem variables where we can. So the primary objectives are developed with an achievement plan. This is the approach that we would take to this, using specific projects, and you had seen in the Commission's annual research plan would then be derived from that and addresses the elements of the 5-year plan. That's kind of where, Mr. Chairman, that's just a broad overview of the package.
Many thanks, Bruce. I know we all probably have a number of questions. I have a few, but let me open the floor first to my colleagues, commissioners. And poor Bruce has to play double duty here and checking on Philip and Ralph as well. So, Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I like the research plan, and I think it's laid out fairly well. However, when you present it, for example, when we're looking at ontogenetic and seasonal movements, so it says we should develop estimated movements, estimated movement rates, etc. But when you told us that, you said these have significant impacts downstream. That may be your opinion, but the reason we're doing the research is to determine if that's the case. So I think you got to be careful when you set it up. And similarly, these have significant impacts that are in the second one. Well, in my mind, I think that when we study, that's my belief. So I think
intent behind this statement was not any particular impact here. They're just a general knowledge that those rates of movement. So, but your point is very well made. Thank you.
Other comments from commissioners? Questions? By the way, I would, if you agree, Jim, I would like to encourage our 2 science advisors if they also have specific comments and questions too. I see Robin here and Lowe's over there, so I will ask them to participate and contribute as they see fit as well. So other commissioners first? Questions? Paul, do you have any?
Thanks very much, Bruce. I guess just going back to the process, on page 2 it talks about the Research Advisory Board and the Scientific Review Board, which is yet to be formed. And I guess maybe a bit of a reminder about how we see the Scientific Review Board playing into this role going into the future.
Mr. Ryle, the current concept that we have for this is that the staff would be developing research plans to be reviewed first through the RAB process, working with our our industry advisors on this and making sure that we're, one, covering the bases the way they see that things need to be looked at, and then putting these in the context of what the existing 5-year plan might be. These would then be, in our understanding, fed up through the Scientific Review Board prior to getting to you. They would then, after the Scientific Review Board has been through them, ask for modifications, change, and whatever, that would then be fed up to you with their recommendations on that, with also potential in other studies involved as well.
So I guess with those two bodies, maybe you can just expand upon why you see the need to have those two bodies. I guess, Bruce, what different functions would they be performing?
I see two main functions. The Research Advisory Board is much more at an industry level of what industry sees needs to be done in the way of research, what they might think about how we have proposed to do some of the research. Whereas the SRB, I think, is a much more technical. These are basically going to be, analytical folks who will be looking at this and looking at the soundness of the design and so forth, as opposed to the conceptual basis for the project. So I think you need to be assured that when a project comes before you, that it's been soundly vetted in terms of its both technical merits as well as the conceptual basis behind it. So we saw those two bodies as supporting a somewhat different function in that. The SRB also has the additional function of interpreting other information coming out of the staff that's coming to you, whether it be the assessment or other analytical projects that might be coming towards you. And I think in particular things like the harvest advice and so forth, I think you would like to have a scientific review process, which is what came out of our original performance review on this thing, was to have a long-term peer review science process, and the Scientific Review Board would function as that long-term peer process.
So maybe we can come back to that too in broader discussion. But so I like the overall 5-year plan and then the annual plan. But I guess one of the challenges I find is linking the two up. And so in the 5-year plan, it's not clear to me what sort of resources would be required to undertake that. And then when we look at the annual plan, what is the actual linkage between the two? And it would be helpful, maybe just a suggestion anyhow, is that in the 5-year plan that there is a table put together for each of the 4 themes that you've identified, along with what the resources that would be tasked to undertake those, which I think would help provide some direction on how we set priorities for within an annual plan. And maybe at some point in the future we don't have the 2 separate plans really. It's a 5-year plan that lays out what the priorities are over a broader frame than just an annual. But anyhow, just a couple of suggestions.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think we can do that, recognizing that it's going to be a pretty broad stroke for the 4 themes in terms of resources.
Well, I guess one of the challenges I would think then is that so if you dedicate a lot of resources in year 1 on a particular project and then you find out that you're now out of funds in year 2 and 3, that may be a challenge then to meet your priorities.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Paul. Other comments? Does Philip or Ralph have any?
Mr. Chairman, we do have 2, a short one from Commissioner Horty just said, I like the research plan, and then 2 questions from Commissioner Lesnikoff. The first one is that is a tagging study of some kind a feasible method to develop and estimate movement rates among regulatory areas? And a second question, to prevent in-house bias, shouldn't we consider using outside scientists in the peer review process? So dealing with those sequentially, yes, traditionally a tagging program is how we estimate movements. That was the whole basis for the pit tagging program, which I think as when we started that program and introduced you to the concept, we said there was likely to be some surprises coming out of that program, and we did see some surprises on that, and we have continued to keep on looking at alternative ways to get the information that may have been conflicting or confusing that came out of the pit tagging, particularly things like movement rates in Area 4, which we got different results from, say, our stock assessment than some of the raw results that came out of the pit tagging program, although in the raised paper on this, more recent paper, those estimates have come a little bit closer, but there still is a divergence between the two estimates from that. So that's why we wanted to look at some alternative means, such as the archival tags, to try to get a better handle on some of the movements on this. But yes, that is the traditional way that you would try to get at movements. We have looked at other methods, otolith chemistry and so forth, but those tend to be fairly broad brush kind of approach. You can get sort of base and scale things, but it doesn't necessarily help you out with movement rates per se. Second question, to prevent in-house bias, shouldn't we consider using outside scientists? The intent would be to have the SRB populated by outside scientists.
Other questions? Dave, do you have any questions?
I don't have any questions. Just a comment. I'm really pleased with the 5-year research plan, and in particular with Section 4 and the inclusion of MSE into the plan, because I think that's going to be a very important component of the IPHC's activities in the future.
Okay, I have a few thoughts, and then I'd like to see if our science advisors would like to offer some thoughts, and then we can open it up further. Some of them, I'm going to pick up a little bit on a couple of comments that have already been made, but it's sort of around the general issue of governance, I guess, of this whole process. Governance and communication, or how we're able to communicate it both internally and externally. And I think there's several considerations here. One is and I think as some others have raised it, the link, Paul raised it, the link between the annual and the 5-year plan. And I appreciate your point, Bruce, about what level of information, but I think it's important that we embed clearly so people can understand how the identified elements of the annual plan support the 5-year plan. And maybe the integration of the two into one document to help support that visually, let alone substantively, may make sense. And perhaps the National Science Advisors working with you and your science team can help in that regard. But it would make it easier certainly for commissioners, but also for others to understand clearly how the specific and clearly defined funding associated with the annual plan are building on and support the 5-year objectives. I think as Paul said, sort of being able to know that we have sort of, in many cases where there's multi-years in the funding, that we have a clear link between year 1, year 2, year 3, and or anticipated costs associated with that, and also opt-out options and possibilities. Obviously, there's certain things and certain research things that you do, probably you find out that you're not getting what you're looking for, and you may have to make changes, etc. So some of that obviously has to be done only on the basis of assessment, and that's where perhaps the SRB can also play a role beyond its peer review. Now, on that question, I think is, again, on governance of, and you described it helpfully as far as the RAB versus the SRB, but again, I think we should articulate that clearly, and I kind of, Dave could speak to this further, having participated in the RAB, but I get the sense that the RAB is almost like a sounding board from industry. Here's what they see out on the fishing grounds, here are the issues that they see, the questions they have related to that you want to take into consideration. When I say you, the Commission more generally, for the purposes of how does that, but I think the RAB should be informed about how, it shouldn't be just random thoughts in my view. I'm not saying it is, it should be structured, the conversation, or the input maybe is a better way of describing it, from industry into the context of the 5-year plan and the annual plan. And the extent to which industry thinks that either of those, the priorities set aside in the annual and the 5-year plan are different, or do not take into account things that they think are important, that there be some mechanism by which not just that they bring those through the process of the RAB to the attention of the Commission, but they bring that to the attention of commissioners as well in some kind of process beyond the annual meeting. Thirdly, I think there needs to be clear enunciation of, we've talked about this a little bit at the interim meeting and as well in September, of priorities. So we have lots of ideas or lots of proposals and lots of suggestions of things under the 4 themes, for example, and the priority specific projects and issues, but they still remain, the latest version, a list of what those are. I think we need to put more rigor into what would be the ones that are absolutely key to achieving our objectives. What would be in the things we need to do in the first 2 years, for example, in support of the objectives. What are the things, I know, for example, in the annual plan you have high, medium, low priority, but I think it should be more rigorously defining what are, under each of the 4 themes, the high priority, the medium priority, the low priority, and making sure that from an F&A purpose discussion, as we'll have this afternoon, we're ensuring that the funding is allocated accordingly in support of those priorities, and that we're comfortable as a group that that makes sense and that there's the right match between the defined higher priority and the appropriate funding attached to it, knowing that there's going to be limits, obviously, and that's why you make those high, medium, low decisions or proposals or suggestions or recommendations, because there's only a finite number of resources in that. And then fourthly, just to highlight, or maybe to talk about specific priorities that certainly from my perspective I would like to see some comment on and review on by both the science advisors and internally within the commission staff, some views from the science specialist. The first one picks up on something that Jim said, is migration patterns. So I think we seem to be of the view that we went to a coast-wide assessment in 2007 because we felt there was clear enough migration evidence to suggest that such an approach made sense. So maybe that needs to be assessed again in the context of doing further work on migration. Do we need to continue a coast-wide assessment approach? Or how do we want to link additional scientific migration pattern research to that broader stock assessment process, either to validate it or not? I think that is key. I think Jim is absolutely right in saying we shouldn't have an opinion on this. We need to have a series of facts, and I understand that a lot of the migration work is not out of date, but it is dated. And what can we do in the context of that is not just effective, but also what I would call timeliness effective, and also cost effective. For example, and again, Robin can speak to this further, tagging is helpful, but takes a lot of time and is expensive, right? Simulation modeling might be something that can be done more quickly, not be as accurate in terms of its results, but while you're waiting for, what would be the balance between those two in support of further migration analysis? What kind of support should we put into tagging vis-a-vis what we should put into simulation studies, etc., that might give us enough information or useful information to be able to make rational decisions, as it might affect, among other things, the coast-wide assessment process. Similarly, I think in the context of the harvest policy advice review that Steve's talked about a couple of times already, and you spoke to as well, Bruce, this morning in your presentation, I'd like to see that broken down a bit more. I mean, Steve's already started that process, and maybe the MSAB will be the venue where that gets done. Because I think from a commissioner standpoint, we should be thinking, I think, Steve, you'd had a sort of a two-year time frame for the work being done. Well, how does that, between now and then, how would that, are we looking at, this is not to be answered today, but commissioners should have a good sense about whether when they're sitting here a year from now, they're trying to integrate information or analysis on an interim basis, or are we basically saying until that issue is completely done over the 2-year period there's going to be no changes to harvest policy advice? It's crucial to the issue of the effective harvest rate and the debate we've been having, the discussion we've been having about that. So are we going to be looking at new information that might affect our decision making next year, or should we be assuming that we're basically not looking at any changes until that whole process is completed? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think we need to be informed on what you're thinking in that regard. And then finally, in terms of research priority, I mean, there are others, and others can comment, is the reliability of the apportionment approach. I don't know whether it's the MSAB process that would address this or how it gets addressed, but I think, as you know, Bruce, on the Canadian side, there's a lot of concerns about the apportionment approach. And I think rather than feeling, as I do now, that I hear what I would call is the emotion behind that view, I'd like to have some scientific evidence and analysis that either substantiates the apportionment process is the right one, or reviews it and determines whether or not it needs to be done in a different way. This links back to the coast-wide assessment as well. Because otherwise we're left with what I feel is a more ad hoc process where we're sort of looking at a coast-wide assessment, but we're making decisions on a regulatory area by regulatory area. And as we look at our decision table, for example, we're asking ourselves the question this week, are we basically going on across the board row, depending on what the overall FCEY is being proposed to be, and is that the right way to do it based on what a lot of people think is a flawed apportionment analysis, or do we need to take sort of regulatory, as indeed how we vote, a regulatory area by regulatory area approach, which may or may not be consistent with the coast-wide assessment and may or may not be consistent with the analysis as revealed through apportionment. So I think as commissioners we need to be conscious of the with the factors that are going into the decisions that we're making when we have to make that decision on a regulatory area. And I think I need to be better, certainly speaking for me anyway, better informed about what those consequences are, those issues are. So the extent to which whether it's the MSAB process, MSC, or some other, the Harvest Policy Review is able to address that and give us at least a good progress report on that in time for next year, I think that would be very helpful from my perspective. So I'll stop there. I don't know whether you want to comment at all on that. Please do so, and then I'll ask our science advisors to chime in.
No, Mr. Chairman, actually, I have no difficulty with those sorts of priorities and the kinds of information that you're looking for out of this. I think giving you some understanding of the timeliness of delivery of some of those elements is obviously critical to your thinking. So, yeah, we're happy to work with all of those.
Okay, can I ask Robin and or Lily if you'd like to make a few comments? Robin, do you want to come down to the corner here, or either corner? Yeah.
Thank you. Just a couple of small comments from me. One is that in general the 5-year research plan seems to cover all the elements of the research that needs to be done, to manage a fish stock. I would agree with the commissioners that I think there ought to be a better connection between the 1-year plan and the 5-year plan, so it's a little bit difficult to map the projects in the 1-year plan back onto the 5-year plan. The headings are different, for example. It might also be, It might also be useful in the 5-year plan to link these specific projects and tasks to the primary objectives. There's a number of primary objectives listed that don't have any specific tasks associated with them, and some of the specific tasks, it's not really easy to see which of the primary objectives they're addressing. I noticed in the ontogenetic movement and migration section, there are quite a few objectives, primary objectives in there that speak to the impacts of movement and the impacts of removals on downstream areas. I didn't see any specific objectives or specific tasks associated with that work, but it does seem to me that perhaps the purpose of the archival work and the archival tag work and the tagging work in general, it might be recast in a new framework now that we have a commitment to update the harvest policy, and we have some very pertinent questions about bycatch and stock structure at the moment. Speaking to your comment, Dr. Bolsiger, that we don't really know what the downstream impacts of bycatch are. So we may need to recast our ideas about what the purpose of the tagging studies are. In the 1-year plan, there are a great deal of projects on archival tagging that all of them seem to map back to a single objective. I think it's Objective 6A, Section 5. There are probably about 8 projects there that all map back to that. So I wonder if it's timely to have some sort of discussion or review on the overall tagging program in general and how it should address current needs and objectives. And I also see throughout the research plan a lot of demands on the time of the analysts, Dr. Martel and Dr. Stewart, modeling the impacts of migration, modeling the impacts of bycatch on other areas, and the effects on the harvest policy. Those aren't small modeling projects. And for a person to be trying to do that at the same time as running a management strategy evaluation that may go for several years and all the other harvest policy work that Steve's going to be doing, I mean, maybe he needs somebody to help him, or maybe there could be a more linked, maybe the research plan should contain linkages among projects so that we can see how the different projects in the 5-year research plan link together in terms of personnel, time, and resources. Thank you.
Many thanks, Robin. Why don't we see if Laura has any comments, and then others can respond as appropriate.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Most of the comments has already been made. I just want to point out 3 items that the staff might want to consider incorporating into either 5-year plan or the 1-year plan. And that is, we tend to be very halibut-centric, as it should be, but there are broad events out there that impacts halibut. That's climate change impacts on all of these 4 themes that is in the 5-year plan. There's the ecosystem aspect, which is the changing composition and prey-predator relationships of components of other organisms in the system that perhaps on a 5-year plan basis we also need to pay attention to. And one thing else that Halibut Commission staff have, but over the years I have not been able to put a finger on, and that's an inventory of all the data we have. As we evaluate importance of different studies for next year, I'd like to know what data that's already have. Are we going to provide more data that's going to be enlightening, or is just going to get another data point? There's some that it's just another data point. Anyway, thank you.
Many thanks. Well, let me see if commissioners want to have a second round of comments, and Bruce as well, and then we'll see if anyone else wishes to add. So, commissioners, any further thoughts? Jim? Anything from Ralph or Philip?
No, nothing there, Mr. Chairman.
Paul, anything else you want to add? Okay, Bruce, any further comments?
No, I actually I appreciate those comments very much, and I think the issue of linkages is important. I actually quite like Robin's issue of the fact of what kind of resources we have to do this, both wet resources and hard resources. So I think that's an important part of it. So we usually have staff identified in our annual plan, but you're right, we should link this back to the overall project so we know what we're getting into when we talk about contemplating that and what its impact might be on Steve. I hate to have him sort of drop dead on me there.
You might as well look like Ian more than you are now. So good. I think we can also have a little bit more of a discussion on this afternoon in the context of the F&A about budgeting, etc. I think Robin's point, for example, to this last issue of making sure Steve or Ian don't drop dead in their tracks, about identifying resources that can support consultants or that kind of support, that kind of research support would be something we may want to consider as part of the F&A discussion. Good. Okay, we're just past 11:30, so I'd like to break for the lunch period. We're supposed to reconvene this group at 12:30, correct? Is it 12:30? I was worried that we were going to run short of time. We've been able to do the research issues, so the focus at our next session is on the bycatch. I am flexible. We may, Jim, if you wish, could delay the start of the afternoon until, let's say, 12:45. Do you need a bit of extra time? Because I think that will be our one item for the 2 hours before the F&A starts. So I think, maybe I could ask Rebecca and how much time you think we need to have. At least an hour. So if we started does it make sense to start at 1 then? That gives us an hour and a half. What do you think, Jim?
I was expecting one. U.S. commissioners are having awkward delegation meetings, so it's not completely predictable how it's going to happen. So I was expecting one to do that. If you wanted 12:45, we could try to go.
No, why don't we agree to one, Bruce?
Just a comment that we didn't deal with the annual plan in any detail. Did you want to reserve that for the F&A to incorporate that in F&A discussion?
Why don't we do that?
Okay.
And that way we can devote the full hour and a half. Let's start at 1. Devote the full hour and a half to the bycatch issue, and then we'll be able to come back to the research issues as appropriate in the F&A discussion after that. Good. So we're adjourned till 1 o'clock. Thank you.